Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a place where the air is thick with incense, smoke curling upward in slow, hypnotic spirals. Imagine yourself stepping barefoot across cool limestone floors, the walls around you painted with gods and kings who never seem to blink. You enter an Egyptian temple at dawn, and already the fires are burning. The priests have piled resins, herbs, and crushed spices into clay burners, and the fragrance is so powerful that your eyes sting and your lungs feel coated in perfume. You're not just walking into a room, you're walking into a cloud of history itself. And here's the wild truth. Those resins and spices swirling around your head are worth more than the gold leaf glinting on statues. You probably wouldn't last a single day working in this haze, but you'd be carrying around a fortune in scent. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you, because there's something kind of magical about this shared midnight caravan we've built together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move deeper into the temple, and every breath tastes like frankincense, sweet, piney, almost citrus. Frankincense trees grew in lands far away, their sap collected in tiny golden tears that hardened in the sun. Traders hauled these nuggets across deserts, through dangers you wouldn't sign up for even if there were air-conditioned camels. Egyptians didn't just burn frankincense for the gods, they treated it as medicine, mixing it into salves to soothe aching bodies or fight infections. Imagine paying more than a month's wages just for the privilege of smelling nice during prayer. And yet, to the ancient world, this was normal. Historians still argue whether the earliest incense routes stretched directly into Arabia or if middlemen disguised their sources, spinning myths to keep competition away. You, wandering here, wouldn't know the truth. You'd just hear tales of winged serpents guarding frankincense groves, or birds building nests out of cinnamon sticks high on cliffs, impossible for ordinary mortals to reach. Were those stories marketing tricks? Almost certainly. But as you cough gently in the temple smoke, you realize storytelling made the price climb just as high as scarcity. Near the altar, a priest sprinkles myrrh into the flames, and the smoke changes, turning darker, more bitter. Myrrh comes from another desert shrub, its gum oozing out like dried tears. Egyptians used it not just for offerings, but also for embalming. You know those wrapped-up mummies everyone loves to joke about? Yeah, without myrrh and resin-packed spices, they'd smell less like eternal kings and more like abandoned leftovers. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found mummies practically marinated in spices like a very grim holiday ham. It wasn't just for smell, it was their version of time-proofing. You follow the scent trail out of the temple, through busy markets where vendors shout about exotic wares. Somewhere between the stalls of papyrus scrolls and painted amulets, you catch sight of tiny sacks of imported cinnamon. To you, it looks ordinary, but in this world, that bundle is a treasure chest. Traders guard their sources so closely that even a pharaoh's scribe might only know half-truths. Comes from the land beyond the horizon, one merchant shrugs, refusing to explain more. What he really means is, I'm not telling you my supplier, because then I'll lose my retirement plan. Imagine the humor of it. You could be a king surrounded by gold, but if you didn't have peppercorns, cloves, or incense, you'd be considered uncultured. It's like showing up to a dinner party today without Wi-Fi. You're technically still alive, but socially you've failed. The deeper truth? Spices weren't just about taste or smell. They symbolized wealth, purity, even a passport to the afterlife. Egyptians believed the gods themselves demanded offerings of fragrance. Without them, rituals were incomplete, and prayers floated away like unanswered emails. Wealthy families burned incense at home, too, even though it was like lighting dollar bills on fire just for ambience. And here's something curious. Archaeologists uncovered an ancient Egyptian recipe book of sorts, inscribed on temple walls. It doesn't list measurements, but it does talk about blending spices, honey, and resins for offerings. Reading it is a bit like finding your grandma's cookbook written in riddles. Add the tears of the desert tree, stir with joy, and present it hot. As the day in the temple stretches forward, the smell clings to your skin, your clothes, your very hair. People outside know you've been inside without you saying a word. It's a status symbol. You reek of holiness and wealth, and you didn't even need jewelry to prove it. One modern aside. If incense really was this valuable, imagine paying rent with a sack of cinnamon sticks. Honestly, some landlords today might accept it. Walking back through the sunlit streets, you notice something else. Every cart and donkey seems to carry something that whispers of faraway lands. Resin from Arabia, pepper from India, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Egypt isn't just a kingdom, it's a giant trade hub, and spices are the most invisible, intangible wealth moving through it. By nightfall, the temples still glow with smoke, offerings rising into the sky. You settle down on the steps, eyelids heavy, and realize that what you've just witnessed isn't a random ritual. It's the foundation of centuries of obsession. People will kill, sail, and gamble empires on these fragrances. For now, though, you just sit in the haze, listening to the crackle of incense, wondering if tomorrow's priests will still argue about whether cinnamon comes from giant phoenix nests or from some anonymous farmer trimming bark. You step away from the temple haze and find yourself on a long, dusty road, one that seems to stretch forever toward the east. The air grows hotter, the sun more relentless, and caravans of camels trudge in front of you, their bells jingling softly. Their burdens? Sacks so tiny you could mistake them for snacks, yet they are packed with black peppercorns, little wrinkled beads that once held the Roman world in thrall. You brush your fingers across one of the bags, and the merchant hauling it jerks his arm back protectively. "Careful," he mutters. "That's worth more than you." Which, frankly, is rude, but also technically true in this age. Pepper, plain old pepper, was once so valuable it was used as money. Roman soldiers sometimes demanded payment in it. Landlords collected it as rent, and ransom could be measured in handfuls of peppercorns. Historians still argue whether this pepper fever was born from real scarcity or from sheer snobbery. After all, pepper grows abundantly in India, but by the time it crossed thousands of miles of desert, mountain, and sea, it might as well have been sprinkled with gold dust. Picture yourself arriving in bustling Rome. The streets are alive with noise, vendors hawking olives, wine, and, if you're rich enough, tiny bags of pepper. A senator struts by, and you can practically hear his toga whisper, "Yes, I can afford seasoning." Roman cooks went wild with it, tossing pepper onto meats, fish, even fruit. If you ever wondered whether someone in ancient times sprinkled pepper on melon and thought it was gourmet, the answer is yes. Somewhere, a Roman foodie was posting on marble tablets, #PepperLife. But the pepper craze wasn't only culinary. Doctors claimed pepper healed everything from indigestion to snake bites. Was it true? Not really. But in a world without Google reviews, if your neighbor swore pepper cured his cough, you bought it by the handful. And honestly, if you've just choked on a bad oyster, a mouthful of pepper might feel like medicine simply because you're too busy sneezing to die. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Roman cookbook, attributed to Apicius, includes more than 300 recipes, and pepper appears in almost every one. It's the ancient equivalent of scrolling a food blog today and realizing every recipe requires just a pinch of Himalayan pink salt. Imagine being the poor servant grinding pepper all day long while your master debates whether honeyed dormice taste better with a light dusting or a heavy snowstorm of spice. You keep walking the trade route, and you notice how pepper turns men into both partners and enemies. Merchants from India haul it across the sea. Arab middlemen mark it up and spin tales of monsters guarding the plantations, and Roman buyers gladly pay whatever is asked. Somewhere along the way, you realize most of what's being sold is not just spice but secrecy. Nobody wants you to know exactly where the pepper grows, because then you might cut them out of the chain. At one point, you pause near a caravanserai where weary travelers huddle by a fire. A storyteller is weaving a tale about how peppercorns are guarded by giant snakes, and to harvest them, farmers must set the plants ablaze. The flames drive away the snakes, but they scorch the pepper, giving it its dark color. Is this true? Of course not. But it's great marketing, and no one in the audience questions it. After all, if you've never been to India, how would you know? The obsession with pepper grew so intense that when Rome was sacked in 410 CE by Alaric the Visigoth, one of his ransom demands was 3,000 pounds of pepper. Think about that. Not gold, not silver, pepper. That's like storming a modern city and demanding pallets of pumpkin spice lattes. And the Romans paid, because to them, losing pepper was like losing dignity. As you trudge further down the road, your sandals kicking up dust, you realize the irony. Pepper is everywhere today, sitting in diners in sad little shakers that no one respects. But back then, it was power, prestige, even a little bit of black magic. One sneeze-inducing berry-shaped trade routes sparked wars and built fortunes. Your stomach growls, and a friendly trader offers you a sample, a flatbread sprinkled with oil and crushed pepper. You bite in, and suddenly the world makes sense. The kick on your tongue is fire and sharpness and heat all at once, a flavor that cuts through bland bread like a trumpet in the night. You get it now. You finally understand why an empire was willing to bleed for this taste. And yet, the more you chew, the more the bigger picture dawns on you. Every tiny grain of pepper represents a chain of lives. The farmer harvesting under the Indian sun, the sailor steering through monsoon winds, the merchant haggling in some smoky port, the guard bribed to let the caravan pass. And here you are, chewing casually, not realizing you've just eaten a dozen stories in one mouthful. The road behind you glimmers with the memory of temples, but here, on the pepper trail, the stakes are higher. Priests burned incense to please gods, but Romans ground pepper to show off to neighbors. Two different hungers, equally expensive. You sneeze, wipe your nose, and laugh quietly. Somewhere across time, a Roman patrician is doing the same thing, coughing dramatically over an overpeppered stew, while servants bow and whisper, "Such refinement, my lord." You follow the pepper trail farther east until the air changes again, humid and fragrant, and the winds carry whispers of something rarer still, cinnamon. Not the powdery stuff you shake onto toast today, but strips of bark, curled into tight scrolls like secret letters from the earth itself. Traders hold them up as if they are relics, and the moment you lean closer, a warmth and sweetness fills your nose, sharp, woody, a hint of honey and smoke. This isn't just flavor, it's perfume, medicine, wealth, and mystery all rolled into one. You quickly learn that cinnamon is a spice of secrets. For centuries, nobody in Europe or the Middle East really knew where it came from. Merchants spun fantastical tales to keep competitors away. One famous story claims cinnamon grew in nests built by giant phoenix-like birds on mountain cliffs. To harvest it, locals supposedly left out huge chunks of ox meat. The birds carried the meat back to their nests, which were too heavy to support the weight, and the nests came tumbling down, cinnamon sticks and all. Sounds like a cartoon, right? And yet, for centuries, that story held. Historians still argue whether people truly believed these myths, or whether they just enjoyed the spectacle of them. The truth: cinnamon came from the bark of trees growing in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and parts of India. But for ancient buyers, that fact was locked away tighter than a vault. Arab and later Venetian traders guarded it fiercely, selling cinnamon at prices that made gold look like pocket change. And as you walk through these spice bazaars, you notice that the less people know, the more they pay. Picture yourself standing in an Egyptian market, centuries before Rome's obsession with pepper. A merchant lifts a cinnamon stick with reverence, as if it's the finger bone of a saint. Priests buy it for temple rituals, using it in incense that rises with their prayers. Apothecaries grind it into powders, claiming it cures fevers, stomach aches, even bad breath. Meanwhile, aristocrats stuff it into wines and stews to prove they've arrived in life. Cinnamon was the original status update. A pinch in your porridge, and suddenly you were broadcasting wealth. Here's a quirky tidbit. Cinnamon was so prized in ancient Egypt that it ended up in embalming recipes. Imagine being a pharaoh and demanding that your body smell like spiced cider for eternity. Archaeologists have found traces of cinnamon in burial chambers thousands of years old, suggesting that even in death, royals didn't want to smell like ordinary humans. As you continue your walk, you overhear Greek scholars debating cinnamon's origins. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote about those giant bird nests, swearing up and down that it explained the mystery. Other writers claimed cinnamon grew in marshes guarded by venomous bats or giant serpents. Clearly, National Geographic, Spice Edition wasn't fact-checked in the ancient world. But the more bizarre the myth, the more buyers believed in its worth. After all, if it takes slaying a monster to harvest a spice, surely it deserves to cost a king's ransom. The Romans eventually caught cinnamon fever too, paying outrageous sums to have it shipped all the way to their tables. Pliny the Elder, a Roman author, grumbled in his writings that cinnamon was absurdly overpriced, but even he admitted that demand was unstoppable. Think about it. Rome controlled vast territories, conquered peoples, plundered treasures, but when it came to cinnamon, even emperors had to cough up the coin like everybody else. One evening, as you sit with traders around a fire, someone hands you a cup of spiced wine, sweetened with honey and infused with a stick of cinnamon. You take a sip, and it's like liquid warmth, soothing and exotic all at once. You realize this is the taste people were willing to gamble fortunes for, the taste that fueled centuries of dangerous voyages. And yet, it's just tree bark. Imagine explaining that to a time traveler from Rome. Yeah, we use it in breakfast cereal now. You'd probably get stabbed with a stylus. Still, the importance of cinnamon wasn't only taste or smell. It carried spiritual weight. In Jewish ritual texts, cinnamon is mentioned as one of the sacred ingredients for holy anointing oil. Early Christians, too, linked it to purity and divine presence. To burn cinnamon was to send not only fragrance into the heavens, but also prayers wrapped in sweetness. As the night deepens, you wander past sleeping caravans and think about how fragile this empire of spice really is. If someone somewhere decided to spill the truth, that cinnamon comes from trees, not bird nests, the entire economy might collapse. Knowledge was as valuable as the spice itself, and secrecy was the real treasure chest. You lie down under the stars, cinnamon-scented air drifting in lazy waves, and you wonder, were the myths born to protect the trade, or did people really imagine giant birds hoarding bark in cliffside nests? Historians still argue whether these legends were propaganda or genuine belief, but as your eyes close, you realize it almost doesn't matter. Myths, after all, often carry more weight than facts when fortunes are at stake. The road winds further east, and suddenly the air feels heavier, lush with the scent of blossoms you can't quite place. You stumble into the Maluku Islands, also called the Spice Islands, a scatter of emerald dots in the vast ocean. Here, the trees themselves seem to hum with power. Their branches are studded with tiny buds that, when dried, become cloves, the spice so coveted that entire empires once bled for them. You brush against a branch, and the scent leaps up, sharp, sweet, almost medicinal. Cloves don't just smell nice, they punch you right in the nose. Imagine chewing one raw. Your tongue goes numb, your breath feels like it's been scrubbed with antiseptic, and yet there's sweetness underneath. No wonder ancient people swore by them. Chinese records mention cloves as early as the Han Dynasty, over 2,000 years ago. Court officials had to chew them before addressing the emperor, so their breath wouldn't offend him. That's right, royal meetings came with mandatory breath mints. Historians still argue whether cloves were grown locally in China and then lost, or whether they always came from Maluku via trade. But either way, by the time cloves reached imperial courts, they carried not only fragrance but also prestige. Fast forward a few centuries, and you find cloves making their way into Middle Eastern markets, where apothecaries grind them for medicine. They're believed to heal toothaches, digestion troubles, even repel evil spirits. You sit in a smoky little shop, jars stacked high, and watch as one customer buys a pouch for cooking, while another buys the same spice to stuff in a charm bag against nightmares. One man's stew is another man's exorcism. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Europe during the Middle Ages, cloves were so rare that to sprinkle them into a dish was like dropping diamonds on your dinner plate. Nobles flaunted them in feasts, stuffing meats with cloves until the food was practically a pharmacy. Some even stuck cloves into oranges or apples, creating pomanders they carried in crowded streets to block out the stench of unwashed humanity. Imagine holding a clove-studded fruit to your nose as you elbow through a medieval marketplace. It's basically the 14th century version of carrying hand sanitizer. But cloves weren't just prized for smell and medicine. They were bound to life and death. In some cultures, clove oil was rubbed on bodies before burial, a way of honoring the dead with fragrance that masked decay. The irony isn't lost on you. The same spice that freshened breath for emperors was used to sweeten corpses for eternity. As you wander deeper into the island groves, the stakes become clear. The trees grow only here, in these few scattered islands. Unlike pepper or cinnamon, cloves don't thrive easily elsewhere. That exclusivity turned the Maluku Islands into a bullseye for European explorers centuries later. For now, though, you just listen to the rustling of leaves and wonder what it must feel like to live in the one place on Earth where the world's fortunes sprout like flower buds. You imagine being a farmer here, harvesting the delicate buds by hand, drying them in the sun until they darken to the familiar nail shape. You know these sacks will travel thousands of miles, change hands dozens of times, and by the time they reach Venice or London, they'll be guarded by men with swords and cannons. And yet, to you, they're simply part of the trees you've grown up with. The night market in Maluku is buzzing. Traders from Arabia, India, and China mingle, their ships anchored offshore. You hear a story whispered around the fire. Cloves are so potent that if you plant one in the wrong soil, the earth itself rejects it. Is it true? Hard to say. But like cinnamon's bird nests and pepper's fiery snakes, the myth only boosts the value. The rarer and stranger the origin, the more coins it pulls from pockets. By now, you're starting to notice a pattern. These spices aren't just condiments, they're symbols of control, secrecy, and imagination. People weave legends around them because reality, just dried flower buds, is too ordinary for something worth more than gold. As you prepare to rest under the stars, the air still thick with clove fragrance, you can't help but smile. Once, a Chinese courtier nervously chewed these buds so he wouldn't offend the emperor's nose. Centuries later, European nobles would stick the same spice into oranges to ward off plague smells. And here you are, lying beneath the trees that started it all, realizing that the tiniest of buds has kept the world spinning, sneezing, and arguing for centuries. You leave the clove groves behind and sail onward, the sea stretching out in rolling silver under the moonlight. Soon you reach the Banda Islands, tiny specks of green in the endless ocean, but don't let their size fool you. These islands are the only place on Earth where nutmeg trees grow naturally, and their bounty once triggered wars, treaties, and massacres. Step ashore, and you're met by the sweet, spicy perfume drifting from groves where nutmeg fruits hang like golden apricots. You pick one and split it open. Inside is a hard brown seed, the nutmeg itself, wrapped in a delicate web of crimson lace called mace. Two spices from one fruit, both treasures. When dried and ground, nutmeg gives food a sweet, warm bite, perfect in stews or drinks. Mace, rarer still, adds an even subtler fragrance. In a world starved for flavor, this double gift is practically sorcery. Early traders swore nutmeg cured the plague. During outbreaks in Europe, desperate families stuffed nutmeg into pomanders, drank nutmeg tonics, even wore nutmeg necklaces, hoping to ward off death. Historians still argue whether nutmeg's reputation as a miracle medicine came from any real effect. After all, it does contain compounds with mild medicinal properties, or whether it was mostly wishful thinking stirred by merchants' silver tongues. Either way, nutmeg became less a spice and more a talisman. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nutmeg can actually cause hallucinations if you eat too much. Some medieval texts warn of dizziness, visions, or even madness from overindulgence. So yes, centuries before anyone brewed magic mushrooms into tea, unlucky dinner guests were tripping on nutmeg pie. You imagine a noble at a feast, wobbling in his chair after a third helping, insisting the turkey just winked at him. But behind the sweet taste lies a bitter truth. The Banda Islands' monopoly on nutmeg made them a glittering prize for European powers. At first, traders came politely, Arabs, Chinese, Indians, buying and bartering for the precious spice. But once Portuguese, Dutch, and English sailors arrived with cannons, politeness dissolved. The Dutch in particular seized control with ruthless force in the 1600s, massacring or enslaving much of the local population to secure their monopoly. A dream of flavor for the wealthy turned into a nightmare for the people who actually lived among these trees. You walk through a Banda grove at dusk, the shadows long, the scent of nutmeg heavy in the air. The ground is littered with fallen fruits, their mace glowing like embers in the fading light. It's hard to reconcile this beauty with the violence it sparked. You imagine the traders who once walked here, some hopeful, some desperate, some armed to the teeth, knowing that whoever controlled nutmeg controlled a fortune. In Europe, nutmeg fever was unstoppable. Rich households grated it into everything: meat, vegetables, desserts, mulled wine. Doctors prescribed it for stomach pains, insomnia, or simply to cheer the spirits. A sprinkle of nutmeg meant luxury, a whisper of the far-off islands you'd never see. To serve nutmeg at a banquet was to shout, "I can afford oceans." And yet, like all obsessions, it edged toward the absurd. In 1621, after the Dutch secured control of Banda, they guarded nutmeg trees like crown jewels. To keep rivals away, they sometimes coated seeds with lime before shipping them, ensuring they wouldn't sprout if stolen. Imagine being so protective of a spice that you sabotage its offspring before letting it travel. You sit on the beach now, waves lapping gently, and a trader passes you a cup of warm nutmeg milk. It's soothing, slightly sweet, and as you sip, you understand why people clung to it in times of plague and fear. Even if it didn't truly cure disease, it offered comfort, and sometimes comfort is its own kind of medicine. As night falls, the stars burn fiercely above the Banda Islands. You breathe in the spiced air, realizing you're sitting at the crossroads of dreams and nightmares. Nutmeg brought sweetness to kitchens and warmth to sickbeds, but it also brought conquest and bloodshed to the very soil beneath your feet. And like so many treasures before, it proved the simple rule: the rarer the spice, the higher the price, and the heavier the cost. You sail on from the Banda Islands, your ship creaking as it noses westward, and before long the breeze shifts. It carries with it a sharp, lemony heat that tingles the back of your throat. You dock at a bustling port along the Indian coast, where markets overflow with twisted, knobby roots piled high like dragon claws. This is ginger, humble-looking, gnarled, mud-streaked, but don't let appearances fool you. Those lumpy rhizomes once cost so much that only kings and emperors could dream of feasting on them. You crouch beside a vendor's basket and break a piece of root open. The smell leaps out, fiery, fresh, almost citrus. You chew a sliver, and it burns your tongue before mellowing into warmth that spreads down your chest like a tiny stove has been lit inside you. Instantly you see why ancient traders swore by it. Ginger didn't just spice food. It revived weary travelers, calmed seasick stomachs, and made feasts taste alive. In India and China, ginger had been treasured for millennia. Ayurvedic texts describe it as the universal medicine, good for digestion, joints, even memory. Chinese healers boiled it into teas to balance the body's qi. Historians still argue whether ginger's medical reputation was founded on real benefits. Modern science does confirm its anti-nausea properties, or whether it was amplified by centuries of hopeful repetition. But sitting here, feeling that glow in your belly, you don't much care. The root works its quiet magic. Here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval England, a pound of ginger could buy you a whole sheep. Imagine holding a sack of roots and deciding whether to season your pudding or start a farm. Records show that King Henry VIII even prescribed ginger as a treatment for the plague. Did it work? Not really, but in fairness, most of his medical advice was questionable. You stroll deeper into the port, and the smells wrap around you. Pepper, cardamom, turmeric, but ginger dominates, sharp and assertive. Ships line the harbor, their decks stacked with dried ginger packed into barrels. From here, it will sail west to Venice, north to London, east to China, traded and retraded until it costs more than gold dust. Somewhere along the chain, every hand takes its cut, and ginger grows ever more precious. At a nearby inn, cooks slice ginger into stews thick with lentils and rice. The aroma fills the courtyard, and you watch merchants devour bowls, their sweat dripping as much from the spice as from the heat. For them, ginger is more than flavor. It's fuel, a way to keep moving through endless negotiations. You sneak a taste, and suddenly the simple meal feels like a banquet. The stories about ginger aren't always flattering. Some medieval physicians claimed it inflamed lust, making it a risky ingredient in monasteries. Imagine a monk sneaking ginger tea, and then worrying he's doomed to sin. Others said it granted long life, which probably explains why it shows up in so many royal kitchens. Everyone wants to live forever, especially if the secret ingredient is as simple as spicing your pie. As twilight falls, you find yourself sitting with sailors, their laughter rolling with the waves. One of them pulls a pouch from his belt, filled not with coins, but with dried ginger. He explains that merchants sometimes carried spice instead of money. It was lighter, more durable, and in many places, more trusted than coinage. He jokes that if he were robbed, at least the thief would sneeze while counting his loot. The night market buzzes around you, ginger tea steaming in clay cups, candied ginger glistening like jewels, dried roots stacked high. The more you watch, the more you realize ginger's power lies in its balance. Fiery enough to awaken, gentle enough to soothe, common enough in its native land, yet exotic everywhere else. That contradiction turned it into a treasure. As you prepare to rest, the scent still clinging to your hands, you smile at the thought of how far ginger will travel. From these docks, it will ride caravans, fill apothecary jars, sweeten Christmas puddings, and even show up centuries later in gingerbread houses that children decorate at Christmas time. From sacred medicine to holiday kitsch, ginger has walked a very long road. And here you are at the start, sitting in the glow of lanterns, listening to sailors argue over whether it cures seasickness or just makes the vomit taste nicer. The ginger roots fade behind you as you wander inland, climbing into green hills striped with terraces and groves. The air grows sweeter here, perfumed with something more delicate than the bite of pepper or ginger's fire. You pause beneath tall, reed-like stalks with pods dangling like little treasure chests. A farmer splits one open, and the scent that drifts out is bright, floral, and citrusy cardamom. To modern eyes, it might seem like just another spice jar gathering dust in a cupboard, but here in antiquity, it's as prized as silver, used in both feasts and sacred rituals. You crush a pod between your fingers and release a rush of aroma that seems to cut through fatigue itself. Cardamom is subtler than cloves, lighter than cinnamon, but no less powerful. You pop a seed into your mouth and chew, sharp at first, then cooling, almost mint-like. Your breath feels fresher instantly. No wonder ancient traders carried it in their pouches as both a snack and a medicine. Cardamom has deep roots in Indian and Middle Eastern life. In Sanskrit, it's called ela, and Ayurvedic texts praise it as a cure for stomach complaints, coughs, and even melancholy. The Greeks and Romans adored it too, using it in perfumes and oils. One Roman poet wrote that a lady's kiss should smell faintly of cardamom, though historians still argue whether that was a genuine custom or just his personal fantasy. Either way, you can imagine the wealth required to scent your very breath with a spice more valuable than coin. Here's a quirky tidbit. In ancient Babylon, cardamom was burned as incense during weddings, the smoke believed to inflame love and ensure fertility. Picture yourself at one of those ceremonies, guests fanning themselves, the air thick with perfumed smoke, and everyone trying not to cough while pretending it's all very romantic. As you descend into a bustling marketplace, you see how cardamom slips between rolls with ease. Apothecaries grind it into powders for medicine. Priests buy it in sacks to burn during rituals, the smoke curling toward the gods. Bakers stir it into sweetbreads and honey cakes. In each context, cardamom is precious, a bridge between body, spirit, and palate. You realize that no other spice so seamlessly plays all three roles. You pause at a stall where a merchant is hawking cardamom pods alongside frankincense. He boasts that the spice comes from the Garden of Paradise itself. Maybe he's exaggerating, but as you breathe in the aroma, you believe him for a second. Legends cling to cardamom like dew, stories that it sprouted from the tears of a goddess, or that it can banish evil spirits if burned at midnight. Whether those tales are truth or sales pitch, you can't quite tell. But they do explain why buyers keep opening their purses. One cook lets you taste a cup of hot milk infused with cardamom and honey. The drink is soft, velvety, and calming, like a lullaby in liquid form. You take another sip, and wonder if this is why so many believe cardamom soothes the heart. It's not just flavor, it's comfort. And sometimes comfort sells even faster than promises of eternal life. The spice caravans here move steadily, camel bells tinkling as sacks of cardamom join pepper, cinnamon, and cloves heading west. A sailor tells you that in Venice, cardamom is worth its weight in silver. In London centuries later, it will flavor gingerbread, mulled wine, even early coffee brews. And yet here, among the hills, it's part of daily life, still precious, but not exotic. The irony hits you. The nearer you are to the source, the less mysterious it feels. Distance, not rarity alone, is what transforms a pod into treasure. As the sun sets, smoke from temple fires drifts across the hills. Cardamom mingles with frankincense, a fragrance so heady it makes your eyelids heavy. You lie back, the scent clinging to your clothes, and realize this is how civilizations built entire identities. One pinch of spice at a time, one myth layered on top of another. Somewhere far away, nobles will one day flaunt cardamom to prove sophistication. But here, tonight, it's simply the breath of the earth, a gift of green hills and quiet rituals. The hills fade into mist behind you, and your path bends toward the southern coastlines of Arabia, where the air grows drier and salter, carrying the smell of the sea. Here, the treasure isn't a seed or a root but sticky golden tears that harden in the sun, frankincense. You notice scraggly trees clinging stubbornly to rocky soil, their bark scarred and weeping. Men move among them with knives, cutting precise slits, coaxing out milky sap that slowly thickens and drops to the ground. This, you realize, is the lifeblood of empires. You bend close to a piece and catch its scent, piney, citrusy, and a little sweet, with an undertone of something mysterious you can't quite pin down. Burn it, though, and the fragrance explodes into smoke that wraps around you like an invisible cloak. For centuries, this smoke was thought to carry prayers straight to the heavens. Temples from Egypt to Babylon demanded it daily. A pharaoh without frankincense might as well show up to worship barefoot and empty-handed. The trade in frankincense birthed entire kingdoms. The Nabateans, who carved Petra into rose-red stone, grew rich guarding the routes that carried sacks of this resin north. Rome, insatiable as ever, burned tons of it in funerals, weddings, and feasts. In fact, historians still argue whether Nero really burned a year's worth of Arabia's frankincense harvest at his wife's funeral just to show off. Was it grief, arrogance, or both? Either way, imagine being the farmer back in Arabia, realizing your hard-won harvest had just gone up in smoke for one emperor's ego. Here's a quirky bit. The ancient Egyptians used frankincense not only in religious rituals, but also as an ingredient in their cosmetics. They ground it into powder to make heavy black eyeliner. Yes, that iconic Cleopatra look may have carried the faint tang of sacred incense. Think about it. One moment it's sending prayers skyward, the next it's smudged under someone's eyelids at a banquet. Spices and resins never stayed in one lane. As you follow a caravan along the incense road, you see how valuable this commodity was. Armed guards march alongside, for bandits lurk in the hills like moths to a flame. Even camels, those desert workhorses, were jingling bells not just for cheer, but to alert against raiders at night. And you, trudging along, can't help noticing that each sack of frankincense is treated as though it contains royal jewels. Which, in a way, it does. When you finally reach a bustling port on the Red Sea, the air is thick with competing smells: fish, tar, sweat, and above them all, the resinous perfume of frankincense and its cousin myrrh. Ships are being loaded under the scorching sun. You overhear a merchant bragging that frankincense will soon sail to far-off China, where healers will prize it as medicine. Another boasts that priests in Jerusalem have already paid handsomely for it, refusing to conduct temple rites without the smoke that sanctifies. The irony? Despite its sacred aura, frankincense has some surprisingly practical uses. Ancient healers chewed it to freshen breath or mixed it into salves for wounds. Even modern science has poked at it, finding compounds that might reduce inflammation. Somewhere between holy offering and breath mint, frankincense has always walked the line between divine and daily life. Night falls over the port, and you lie near the water, the glow of braziers painting the waves in gold. Merchants haggle, sailors sing, camels groan. You watch curls of incense smoke drift upward and vanish into the starlit sky, just as countless generations have believed their whispered prayers did. You wonder whether the gods were ever listening, or whether the true miracle was how these tiny drops of tree sap bound half the world into networks of faith, power, and wealth. Your sandals crunch on dry earth, and you lick your lips, tasting the sting of salt carried by the wind. Tonight, the story pauses to remind you that before nutmeg or cinnamon dazzled the elite, there was one mineral that mattered even more. It's not exotic or fragrant or gilded in red threads. It's just salt. Yet in your weary footsteps across deserts and coasts, you quickly realize that salt was as much a spice of life as anything else. Imagine trudging into a Roman army camp. The soldiers eye you with suspicion, but what catches your attention isn't their gleaming helmets or sharpened swords. It's the salt being carefully measured out. You overhear one centurion mutter that his salarium, his payment in salt, is overdue. That's right, the word salary comes from salt. Soldiers needed it not just to season their grim rations, but to preserve meat and keep armies on the march. Without salt, no conquest, no empire. Gold glittered, sure, but you can't sprinkle gold over rancid pork to make it edible. Now, historians still argue whether Romans were literally paid in salt, or whether the term was more symbolic. But what's clear is that salt underpinned the economy like a hidden scaffolding. Roads were built for it, wars were fought over it, and whole cities sprouted where brine pools shimmered under the sun. Step further back in time, and you'd find ancient Egyptians carefully packing their dead in salt to preserve the flesh. Imagine that salt was not only for the living, but also for ensuring a decent afterlife. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and you'll see peasants stirring bland pottages, brightened by a rare pinch of salt, while nobles dined on salted fish brought hundreds of miles inland. The irony? Something so simple could be both daily bread and rare luxury, depending on where you stood in the social ladder. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. In Ethiopia, well into the 19th century, salt bars were still used as currency. Imagine standing at a market stall, counting out slabs of salt to pay for your bread, then sweating nervously as the midday heat threatened to melt away your paycheck. Coins don't dissolve. Salt sometimes does. Your journey takes you across shimmering salt flats that look like mirrors of the sky. Caravans trudge across them, the animals moving slowly, their hooves crunching on crusts of white. You watch as workers in tunics scrape salt from drying pools, stacking it into shimmering pyramids that sparkle under the sun as if made of gemstones. Children run past with skin dusted in white, looking like little ghosts. And yet, this ghostly dust fuels dynasties. In West Africa, kings of Mali guarded salt mines as jealously as gold. Caravans loaded with salt slabs moved north to trade for more exotic luxuries. And in a wonderful irony, gold and salt sometimes swapped places. Gold flowing south, salt flowing north, each considered equal in value by those who needed one more than the other. Think about that next time you casually twist a shaker over your fries. Somewhere in Timbuktu, salt once gleamed with the aura of treasure. You rest near a salt caravan for the night, the camels tied up in rows, the air heavy with the sharp, dry smell of their loads. The men sit around small fires, sprinkling a few granules into their broth as though performing a blessing. Salt, for them, is not just flavor, it's life, protection against hunger, and a shield against decay. Without it, food rots, trade halts, and power crumbles. Still, even salt's supremacy met competition. As pepper, cinnamon, and saffron stormed into the markets, nobles began to chase those foreign thrills, leaving salt as the humble necessity. Yet without its foundation, those fancier luxuries could never have traveled so far. Salt was the stage on which all the other spices strutted. You lie awake, gazing at the stars reflected on the salt flats, realizing that this plain, gritty substance was the quiet giant of human survival. You think of armies marching, mummies resting, peasants cooking, and kings trading, all connected by those tiny, sparkling crystals. And in the back of your mind, you laugh softly, because in a way, your own sweaty brow is also proof of salt's power. You wake before dawn, rubbing your eyes as the campfire smoke still clings to your clothes. The salt caravan you slept beside is already preparing to move, camels groaning and swaying as slabs are heaved onto their backs. But tonight, your path veers toward a darker, richer scent. The forests of India, where peppercorn vines climb trees like green ladders. You can almost taste it before you arrive, sharp, biting, a little sneeze lurking at the back of your nose. Pepper, black, white, green, tiny beads that once commanded more wealth than nearly anything else. You trudge into a bustling market in Calicut. The air is thick with spice dust, and merchants shout in languages you can't quite follow. You press through a crowd where sacks of peppercorns spill open, looking like piles of black pearls. People argue over them, as though haggling over precious jewels. And in a sense they are. Pepper was the most traded spice in the world for centuries, shaping routes, economies, even empires. Imagine Roman nobles reclining at their banquets. They dip figs into honey, sip wine laced with herbs, and then demand pepper on nearly everything. A roasted boar? Sprinkle it. Lentils? Pepper. Even desserts sometimes got the treatment. It was Rome's culinary obsession, a small dark that linked India to Europe across deserts and seas. Historians still argue whether Romans truly grasped where pepper came from, or if they thought it just magically appeared from some distant, exotic edge of the map. Here's a fringe tidbit. In medieval Germany, wealthy merchants would lock up their pepper in vaults, treating it like bullion. The pepper wasn't left in the kitchen, it was guarded, rationed, displayed as a status symbol. Some towns even demanded taxes in pepper. So imagine paying your landlord with a scoop of peppercorns instead of a coin. Suddenly your sneeze-inducing dinner seasoning feels like high finance. But pepper wasn't just about flavor, it was power. In Venice, merchants created near monopolies, controlling its flow into Europe. The city rose on black pepper's back, ships braving storms and pirates just to bring home more sacks of the pungent treasure. You can almost hear the creak of galleys, the groan of oars, the splash of waves against painted hulls, all for pepper. The Portuguese smelled profit too. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, his sights weren't just on glory or maps, they were on pepper. Those black beads filled his ships and poured into Europe, breaking Venice's grip and reshaping trade forever. Whole naval wars followed, and all for something now sitting quietly in your kitchen grinder. You step into the spice forests themselves, walking between tall trees wrapped in vines. The peppercorn clusters dangle like green grapes. Workers carefully pluck them, staining their hands, then lay them to dry until they wrinkle into the hard black spheres you recognize. The air tingles, so sharp that you catch yourself sneezing, and a farmer laughs at your grimace. You remember how pepper, once called black gold, justified voyages that risked lives and kingdoms. At night, you sit in a village hut. A simple stew simmers, and when a pinch of pepper is tossed in, the whole pot transforms, warm, rich, alive. You realize how something so small can shift a meal, a trade route, even the balance of power. You smile because somewhere in a Venetian palace, a merchant is also sneezing, holding a sack worth more than his silk robes. And yet Pepper's story carries irony. It was so abundant in India that locals barely treated it as treasure. Children chewed the berries for fun, while European nobles spent fortunes to sprinkle a few grains on pork. The disconnect is almost comical, like someone today spending a year's salary on ketchup packets. But that's the magic of perspective and of long-distance trade. You lean back, stomach warm from stew, and listen to the night chorus of frogs and cicadas. The vines rustle in the breeze, as if whispering secrets of power and profit. Pepper, the little berry, turned oceans into highways, funded palaces, and toppled monopolies. And here you are, dusted with spice, drifting into sleep with the same faint tingle on your tongue that emperors once demanded by the fistful. You wake to the creak of masts and the groan of ropes, the salty air stinging your nose. The ship you've hitched a ride on is no grand Venetian galley, but a cramped, busy merchant vessel. The deck is crowded with bales, sacks, and barrels, every inch reserved for cargo. And at the very heart of this floating fortune, spice. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove, all tucked into sacks that smell so intoxicating you almost forgive the stench of fish and sweat that hangs over everything else. Almost. Sailors rush about, tightening knots, patching sails, shouting curses at the wind as if scolding a stubborn mule. You steady yourself against the rail, staring out at the endless horizon. Somewhere ahead lies a port city hungry for spice, and behind you, distant plantations where those tiny seeds and bark strips were worth more than silver coins. It's a strange thought that the fates of entire nations are bobbing right now in barrels under your feet. Here's the mainstream fact. Venetian merchants, masters of Mediterranean trade, once controlled much of this traffic. They didn't sail to India themselves, but relied on Muslim traders to bring pepper and cinnamon across the Red Sea and through Alexandria. Venice took its cut, marked up the price outrageously, and Europe paid without much choice. Historians still argue whether Venice's near monopoly actually slowed down Europe's curiosity about the wider world, or whether it pushed explorers like Columbus and da Gama to find direct routes out of sheer frustration. A quirky tidbit. Ships didn't just carry spices, they carried rats, lice, and fleas. Imagine paying more than gold for pepper, and then realizing your cargo also contained a few uninvited plague passengers. In fact, when the Black Death swept across Europe, some whispered that it followed the spice routes themselves. Not the kind of seasoning you want sprinkled across your life. The work aboard is relentless. Spices are precious, so barrels are inspected constantly for leaks, mold, or rot. Pepper might last, but cloves can go damp, cinnamon can crumble, nutmeg can lose aroma. You picture a merchant tearing his hair out at the thought of soggy nutmeg, weeping into his coin pouch. To keep everything dry, sailors air out the cargo when the weather's calm. You watch them haul barrels into the sun, roll them across the deck, and then stack them again, all while muttering about storms brewing. At night, the ship rocks, and you try to sleep on a coil of rope. Around you, sailors whisper of pirates. They don't mean Jack Sparrow. They mean cutthroats who would gladly slit throats for sacks of pepper. And it's not fantasy. Piracy haunted the spice routes, from Mediterranean corsairs to Malay raiders near the Strait of Malacca. Each barrel of spice was practically a glowing beacon saying, "Rob me, I'm worth a king's ransom." One sailor tells you about insurance. Yes, medieval insurance. Wealthy investors in Venice and Genoa pooled money, so if a spice-laden ship sank, the loss was spread among them. Essentially, the world's first modern banking tricks were invented to safeguard peppercorns and cinnamon sticks. Funny how Wall Street traces its roots back to worried spice merchants who didn't want to cry alone over a storm-drowned ship. The food on board, of course, is abysmal. Hardtack so stale it could chip a tooth, salted meat that smells a bit too alive. But every now and then, a cook sneaks a pinch of pepper or clove from the cargo. Suddenly the gray sludge transforms into something almost bearable. You realize why people risked everything for these flavors. They weren't just luxuries, they were lifelines against monotony. You chew your ration and think, without spice, life at sea might taste like despair. The journey is long, and storms hit hard. Waves crash, barrels break free, sailors scramble. You cling to the mast as the ship lists dangerously. In the chaos, one barrel splits open, peppercorns scattering across the deck like black marbles. The sailors shriek, not out of fear for their lives, but because every rolling bead represents lost gold. They scramble after them on hands and knees, slipping, cursing, trying to shove the pepper back into sacks as the storm thrashes the ship. You can't help laughing. It looks like the world's most desperate game of marbles. Weeks later, the ship limps into Venice. The city rises from the water like a jeweled crown, palaces gleaming, gondolas gliding. Merchants on the docks shout, eager to snatch up the cargo. Guards stand ready, crossbows at their sides, because where there's spice, there's always greed. You watch as barrels are unloaded, rolled into counting houses, and locked away behind iron doors. From there, pepper will scatter across Europe, appearing on noblemen's tables, in apothecaries' jars, and in whispered business deals over wine. As you step off the gangplank, the sailor's already preparing for another voyage. You realize that spice wasn't just flavor, it was a system. Ships, banks, insurance, pirates, empires, all woven together by sacks of dried plants. The sea still rocks in your ears, the salt clings to your skin, and in your pocket you've stolen a single peppercorn. You roll it between your fingers and grin. You're holding the tiny black bead that changed the map of the world. You step off the docks and follow the trail of barrels through the winding alleys of Venice. The salty tang of the lagoon fades, replaced by something far stranger. The dense, heavy perfume of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves being stored, weighed, and bargained over in merchant warehouses. Venice isn't just a city, it's a spice vault. Its very stones seem steeped in pepper dust. In one counting house, men sit at long tables, scribbling numbers into ledgers with quills, muttering in a dozen languages. Florentine bankers, Jewish moneylenders, Greek sailors, even the occasional German trader, they all converge here, orbiting the golden heart of the city, spice. This is where raw pepper turns into contracts, and contracts into castles. You lean over a shoulder to peek at a ledger. The figure written for Piper Nigrum would be enough to buy a manor. Mainstream fact time. Venice didn't produce any spices itself. None. Yet by the 14th century, it controlled much of Europe's supply through trade with the Mamluks in Egypt and the Ottomans later on. Its ships ferried the precious cargo from Alexandria, taxed it, and sold it onward at exorbitant rates. Historians still argue whether Venice's dominance was clever mercantile genius or simply a monopoly enforced by sheer stubbornness and naval might. Either way, Europeans who wanted to taste pepper had little choice but to bow to Venetian prices. A quirky tidbit: in some Venetian contracts, spices were literally used as collateral. A merchant could secure a loan against sacks of cloves, as though he were handing over gold bars. You imagine walking into a medieval pawn shop, slapping down a bag of cinnamon sticks, and asking, "So how much will you give me for this?" Not exactly your neighborhood payday loan. As you walk deeper into the city, you notice the signs of spice wealth everywhere. Grand palaces along the Grand Canal are built on spice profits, marble facades, arched windows, gilded balconies. You duck into a church, and even here the smell lingers. Priests burn incense laced with exotic resins, and you realize worship itself has been flavored by trade. The faithful inhale cinnamon-sweet smoke, and few stop to think that the fragrance was shipped across deserts and seas before rising toward heaven. And yet, beneath the grandeur, you sense tension. A group of dockworkers grumble about high prices. Housewives argue in the market over whether they can afford a pinch of pepper for their stews. Venice thrives, but resentment simmers. You overhear a scholar mutter that this city's greed might push others to sail around Africa or across unknown seas. He's not wrong. This monopoly, you realize, is both Venice's crown and its ticking time bomb. One evening, you slip into a tavern near the Rialto Bridge. The air inside is thick with laughter, dice games, and the unmistakable aroma of mulled wine steeped with cinnamon and cloves. You sip the hot drink and nearly burn your tongue, But it's worth it. Liquid proof of the city's global reach. Around you, merchants gossip. A new Ottoman tax in Constantinople. A storm sinking a Genoese vessel. Whispers of Portuguese captains daring to skirt around Africa. The room hums with speculation, greed, and just a hint of fear. And here's a scene worth remembering: the spice auctions. Picture a crowd of men jostling in a crowded hall, voices rising, fists shaking, bids flying. Barrels are cracked open, the aromas wafting into the air like siren songs. Buyers stick their noses into sacks of pepper, nibble a clove, rub cinnamon bark between their fingers, pretending to judge quality while really just savoring the thrill. The auctioneer's hammer falls, and fortunes change hands in an instant. Historians still argue whether these auctions were more about fair commerce or outright spectacle. Some suggest they were designed to inflate prices, with Venetian officials orchestrating scarcity like stage managers. Whatever the case, you realize spice wasn't just food. It was theater performance, the drama of wealth compressed into a single bead of pepper. You stroll along the canals at night, gondolas gliding past with lanterns glowing on the water. Behind shuttered windows, families dine, sprinkling tiny pinches of spice on their dishes. You wonder how many of them know that their clove-studded roast or peppered stew links them directly to forests in Indonesia or coasts in India. Probably none. But that's Venice's secret power. It made the world taste small, while hiding the enormous distances in between. On your last day in the city, you climb the campanile and gaze out at the lagoon. Ships swarm below, heading eastward, loaded with coins, and westward, loaded with spice. You can almost trace the invisible threads stretching from Venice to Cairo, from Cairo to Calicut, from Calicut to Banda, winding around the world like strands of saffron. You realize you are standing in the middle of a spider's web woven entirely of flavor, and Venice is the spider. Yet the air carries an uneasy note. You hear merchants whisper of competition, of hungry nations with new ships and new ambitions. Venice shines now, but empires never last forever. You tuck that thought away, because something tells you you'll need it later. For now, though, you let the cinnamon-sweet air lull you. Venice, the city of spice, hums around you, and for once, you feel like you're part of its secret theater. The gondola rocks gently beneath you as you drift away from Venice, its lantern-lit canals shrinking behind. The night air is thick with salt, and the faintest ghost of cinnamon clinging to your clothes. Ahead lies another hub of spice and power, Genoa, Venice's old rival. If Venice was the spider weaving a careful web, Genoa was the restless wasp buzzing around, ready to sting, steal, and strike. You step onto the Genoese docks and instantly feel the difference. Where Venice feels like a grand stage, Genoa is all grit and muscle. Sailors shout in Ligurian dialect, ropes creak, and the slap of waves against wooden hulls echoes through the narrow harbor. The city clings to steep hillsides, a jumble of warehouses, fortifications, and palaces. You can almost smell the competition in the air, as if ambition itself has a scent, salt, sweat, and the sharp bite of pepper spilled from a broken barrel. Mainstream fact: Genoa and Venice fought bitterly for dominance over Mediterranean trade, clashing in 4 separate wars across the 13th and 14th centuries. For decades, these two republics traded punches, and occasionally entire fleets, over who controlled access to spices from the east. Historians still argue whether Genoa ever truly stood a chance against Venice's tighter stranglehold, or whether the Genoese simply thrived by outmaneuvering their rivals in banking, piracy, and distant colonies. A quirky tidbit: Genoese pirates, yes, actual pirates, once made off with entire shipments of pepper. Imagine some sunburnt sailors leaping onto a Venetian ship, swords clashing, only to spend their evening dividing sacks of peppercorns like candy. Not exactly your average pirate booty, but back then, pepper was better than gold doubloons. You wander uphill through steep alleys called quirky. Laundry hangs between buildings, and the smell of fish mingles with roasting chestnuts. And yet, even here, far from the palaces, you catch the occasional whiff of spice. Someone sprinkling cinnamon into a pot of wine, or cloves simmering in a stew. The Genoese didn't just crave spice for their tables, they craved the wealth it brought. In a vaulted chamber near the port, merchants meet with bankers. This is where Genoa flexes its real power, not just in sales but in silver. The city became Europe's financial powerhouse, lending money to kings and emperors. You listen in as a ledger is read aloud. Loans to the Spanish crown, collateral in spices yet to arrive, interest rates that would make your credit card blush. One banker casually remarks that pepper arriving in 3 months has already been sold 3 times on paper. You blink, realizing you've stumbled into the invention of futures trading, centuries before Wall Street. You duck out of the chamber and join a group of sailors in a tavern. The air is thick with garlic, wine, and roasted meats. Someone slaps down a pouch of pepper on the table, not as a seasoning, but as payment. Drinks are poured, dice roll, and soon you're swept into a game where cloves are wagered like poker chips. The locals laugh at your hesitation, one of them quipping, "Better than coins, eh? At least cloves smell nice when you lose them." Historians still argue whether Genoa's spice wealth was sustainable, or whether the city simply lived too recklessly, burning bright before fading. You catch whispers of Genoese ventures far away, into the Black Sea, even into Iberia. There are rumors of sailors working for Iberian monarchs, carrying Genoese knowledge of maps and ships westward. You file that away. Perhaps it's Genoa, not Venice, that secretly lights the fuse of a whole new age of exploration. At dawn, you climb the city's walls and look out over the harbor. Dozens of galleys bob in the water, sails furled, waiting for the next great venture. The Mediterranean stretches beyond, dotted with ships that might belong to friend or foe, or more often, both at once. Genoa thrives in this gray zone, balancing between commerce, piracy, and finance. The city feels less like a spider web and more like a gambler's table, where fortunes hinge on a roll of dice and the next shipment of spice. And yet, you can't shake a sense of fragility. The palaces are grand, but they cling precariously to the hillsides. The harbor bustles, but you hear mutters of Venetian blockades, of Ottoman expansion, of routes shifting. Genoa is strong, yes, but you sense that it is a strength always tested, always on edge. As you walk back toward the docks, the bells of San Lorenzo Cathedral toll. Its striped marble facade glows in the morning sun, and you step inside to find incense smoke curling upward. The sweet, resinous smell carries you back to Venice's churches, and you realize, whether in rivalry or prayer, spice unites even bitter enemies. Back outside, a sailor grins at you and says, "If you want to see where spice really flows, follow the banker's silver, not just the sailor's sails." You laugh, but the words linger. Genoa might not win every battle, but it's smart enough to finance whoever does. And in the end, you wonder if that makes it the city with the last laugh. The gulls will overhead, the ships creak at anchor, and the scent of pepper clings to your skin. You board again, leaving behind Genoa's hills, knowing you've glimpsed another flavor of the spice trade. Rougher, riskier, but no less intoxicating. You stand now on the shores of Egypt, the desert sun hammering down as the Nile glitters like molten glass nearby. The air feels heavier here, perfumed with a blend of dust, donkey sweat, and, oddly enough, frankincense smoke drifting lazily from a street vendor's brazier. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, though it does nothing against the heat. Egypt is not just another stop on the spice road. It is the crossroads, the funnel through which caravans and ships must squeeze if east is to meet west. The bustling city of Alexandria sprawls before you, its lighthouse long gone, but its spirit still alive in the shouts of merchants and the rattle of camel caravans unloading at the docks. You wade into the chaos, and suddenly, the world feels closer than ever. A man in silk from India waves a bundle of cinnamon sticks at a Greek trader. A spice caravan just arrived from the Red Sea, loaded with pepper and ginger, guarded by weather-beaten soldiers still brushing sand from their cloaks. Mainstream fact: for centuries Egypt, first under the Fatimids, later under the Mamluks, dominated the spice trade. Ships from India and the Arabian Peninsula unloaded their goods at Red Sea ports. which were then carried by caravan to the Nile and floated down to Alexandria. From there, Venice and Genoa swooped in, buying the spices that would flavor Europe's stews and wallets alike. Without Egypt, the Mediterranean spice trade would have withered like a peppercorn left too long in the sun. As you weave deeper into the market, a curious scene catches your eye. A merchant carefully measures pepper on a set of gleaming brass scales, not against coins, but against gold dust itself. The value feels absurd, yet here it's treated as casually as weighing bread. Someone behind you whispers, "Cheaper than salt was once, but only if you believe fairy tales." You chuckle softly, knowing salt did rule trade earlier, but in this era, pepper wears the crown. Quirky tidbit, you stumble upon a cinnamon trickster. This is a man selling bundles of cinnamon bark, swearing on his mother's grave that it came from giant birds who pluck it from high cliffs, just like the ancient Greek tales. He gestures dramatically toward the sky, as if a cinnamon-stealing griffin might swoop overhead at any moment. Buyers smile, roll their eyes, but still pay up. You can't help but admire the salesman's flair. Sometimes myth sells better than truth. The crowd grows denser as you reach a caravanserai courtyard. Tired camels groan, collapsing onto the sand with soft thuds, while handlers unload baskets of cardamom pods, sacks of turmeric, and fragrant ginger roots still caked with soil. You inhale deeply, the spices mingling in the air, almost dizzying in their richness. For a moment, it feels like standing inside the world's most expensive pantry. Historians still argue whether Egypt's dominance was inevitable. Geography is geography, after all, or whether it was clever diplomacy and ruthless taxation that kept the trade flowing. You hear an argument break out nearby between two scholars in flowing robes, one insisting Egypt's Red Sea ports were destined for greatness, the other claiming it was the Mamluk Sultan's sheer iron grip that kept foreign traders in check. Their debate fades into the general din, and you smile. It seems even in dusty markets, academics can't resist a good quarrel. You're swept along toward the Nile. A barge rocks gently at the bank, its crew singing a slow, rhythmic chant as they load amphorae filled with spices. One sailor tosses you a wink and jokes, "Better than hauling wheat. At least these sacks won't sprout rats." You glance around at the guarded soldiers, realizing just how valuable this shipment is. One spilled basket could buy an entire neighborhood in Alexandria. You follow the caravan north, trudging along the riverbank as the sun begins to sink. Villagers stop to stare, children point at the exotic goods, and you realize how much of this country survives on the trickle-down of spice wealth. The sultans may skim the profits, the merchants may grow fat, but even farmers and fishermen taste the edge of cinnamon in their daily bread or pepper in a communal stew. As night falls, you rest in a small roadside inn. The keeper sets before you a bowl of lentil soup, plain, earthy, but then, with a flourish, grinds a pinch of black pepper on top. The taste transforms instantly, sharp and invigorating. You pause mid-bite, remembering how this single spice once caused wars, treaties, and bankruptcies. And here it is, sprinkled on your soup, as casual as salt at a diner. In the flickering lamplight, a fellow traveler leans over and whispers conspiratorially, "Do you hear? The Portuguese are prowling south, around Africa. They think they can bypass all this." You raise an eyebrow. If that rumor is true, Egypt's chokehold may one day be pried open. The traveler shrugs, unconcerned, and goes back to his stew. But the seed of doubt lingers. You drift to sleep with the hum of insects outside and the faint aroma of cloves in the air. Egypt feels eternal, yet you sense that change is coming. Change carried not on camels or barges, but on the sails of ships you've yet to see. You wake to the groan of wagon wheels and the low grumble of men lifting sacks at dawn. The Egyptian night has dissolved into pale morning, and you find yourself trailing northward with a caravan that feeds into the Mediterranean. Ahead, the bustling docks of Venice await, though the road takes you there only in your mind for now. Because the truth is this: spices didn't simply trickle into Europe, they poured through Venetian and Genoese fingers like golden sand. By the time you arrive in Venice, Picture the wooden piers creaking under the weight of barrels, gondolas gliding like shadows, and the salty tang of the lagoon mixing strangely with pepper dust. You realize you've stepped into Europe's spice kingdom. The city feels alive in a way different from Alexandria. Here, it isn't the desert caravan or the Nile barge. It's the sound of coins ringing, contracts being signed, and merchants leaning across tables in candlelit counting houses. Mainstream fact: Venice dominated the European spice trade during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, thanks to its contracts with the Mamluks of Egypt and later its direct links to Eastern suppliers. The Venetians controlled the spice supply so ruthlessly that they inflated prices for the rest of Europe, building palaces from pepper. You walk past the Grand Canal, gazing at those palazzi with their ornate facades, each one a silent advertisement. This is what cinnamon built. The air in the Rialto market is so thick with competing aromas, nutmeg, saffron, mace, that your senses nearly short-circuit. Everywhere, traders argue, scribes jot figures onto parchment, and apprentices lug crates marked with symbols from India or Arabia. You overhear a gruff merchant muttering, "This shipment of cloves cost me more than my cousin's dowry, but she doesn't smell this good." You can't resist laughing at the joke, and neither can the scribe scribbling beside him. Quirky tidbit: Venice once taxed pepper so aggressively that it became known as the Pepper Sack Republic. In fact, noble families used sacks of pepper as dowries, and some accounts whisper of marriages sealed not with gold or silver, but with enough pepper to season 100 stews. Imagine walking into a wedding feast and seeing the bride's father dramatically present a chest of fragrant black seeds. It would put any modern-day blender or toaster gift to shame. Historians still argue whether Venice's grip was truly unshakable, or if Genoa came close to snatching dominance with its own daring maritime ventures. Standing in the square, you hear two cloaked men hissing at each other. Genoa had the ships. Venice had the contracts. Their spat is interrupted when a barrel of ginger bursts nearby, spilling roots across the stones. Workers dive to scoop them up before they're trampled, because every shard is worth a small fortune. As you wander, you begin to see the darker side of this wealth. The Venetians thrive, yes, but beyond their canals stretch kingdoms that resent this stranglehold. You overhear a French knight grumble that his king pays through the nose for saffron, while Venetian traders lounge fat and smug in silk robes. Across the market, an English merchant counts coins so slowly you'd think he's savoring the bitterness of each loss. Europe relies on Venice, but it resents her for it. By nightfall, the city transforms into a lantern-lit jewel. Gondolas slide silently past as musicians strum lutes on balconies, their songs perfumed by the faint scent of clove drifting from nearby kitchens. You sit in a tavern, where a plate of bread soaked in olive oil is suddenly dusted with saffron threads by a proud cook. The golden color glows in the candlelight, as though you're eating sunlight itself. And when the innkeeper leans close to whisper the bill, you nearly choke. Those few threads cost as much as your bed for a week. Your companions laugh, telling stories of spice-related disasters. One sailor claims he once sneezed into a sack of pepper so violently that it exploded, showering the entire galley in black dust. Another swears that smugglers once hollowed out candlesticks to hide nutmeg, only to have them melt mid-mass in a cathedral. You don't know whether to believe them, but the absurdity feels fitting in a city where spices are both sacred and profane. As you leave the tavern, you notice a map pinned to the wall, ink lines tracing routes across the Mediterranean, through Alexandria, down to India, curling into mysterious places labeled only as Spice Islands. One sailor, bleary-eyed with wine, taps the parchment and mutters, "Someday, someone will sail past Africa. Then Venice will choke on its own saffron." His words hang heavy in the smoky air, like prophecy disguised as drunken rambling. The canals outside ripple with torchlight, and you pause to watch a gondola drift by, the oarsman humming softly. You imagine the spices packed within the cargo holds all around you, hidden in plain sight, and realize that this city has built a world of marble and music out of flavors that don't grow within 1,000 miles of its shores. Venice feels eternal tonight, yet in the back of your mind, you know no empire, however perfumed, lasts forever. The gondolas fade into the dark, and when you open your eyes again, you're staring not at the glittering lanterns of Venice, but at the pale stone arches of Genoa. The air is sharper here, salted by the Ligurian Sea, and the streets feel narrower, more impatient, as though the entire city is perpetually leaning forward toward the horizon, itching to outpace Venice. Genoa is not as rich in silks and palaces, but it burns with something else: ambition. You wander down to the harbor, where ships crowd shoulder to shoulder, their masts like a forest of spears. The smell of tar, fish, and freshly sawn timber almost masks the faint perfume of pepper and ginger tucked in the holds. Genoese sailors swagger along the docks, loud with laughter, tossing dice on overturned crates, and arguing over who sailed further east, who smuggled the better cargo, who cheated the Venetians hardest. Mainstream fact: Genoa became Venice's fiercest rival in the medieval spice trade. Its merchants carved their way into the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea routes, sometimes winning brief advantages, especially when Venice stumbled under plague or war. At one point, Genoa's fleet nearly crippled Venice during the War of Chioggia in the late 14th century. You picture it now: two Italian city-states, both smaller than modern-day counties, squaring off like heavyweights over tiny dried seeds. The Genoese, however, play a different game. You overhear a merchant boasting that he disguised barrels of cinnamon under layers of salted fish, slipping them past Venetian tax inspectors with nothing more than a poker face and a foul smell. The dogs couldn't sniff spice through herring, he cackles, and you try not to gag at the thought of cinnamon reeking of rotting mackerel. Quirky tidbit: Genoa's bankers once financed spice ventures with contracts so complex that even today's scholars scratch their heads at the math. One surviving document shows a loan where repayment could be made either in coin, in peppercorns, or, incredibly, in the form of trained hunting falcons. You imagine a bewildered creditor accepting a squawking bird as interest payment and deciding maybe gold would have been simpler. Historians still argue whether Genoa could have dethroned Venice if not for its political fragmentation. Unlike Venice, ruled by a tight oligarchy, Genoa often tore itself apart with feuding noble families. As you pass a stone piazza, you witness men in rival colors shouting insults across the square. Spinola thieves, Doria cowards. The quarrel nearly devolves into swordplay until a barrel of saffron tips over, spilling golden threads like sunlight onto the cobbles. The crowd instantly dives for them, brawling forgotten in the scramble. Even here, saffron stops arguments cold. The sea calls you onward, and you accept the Genoese invitation to sail. Their ships are leaner than Venetian galleys, built for speed and daring raids. Out on the water, the horizon seems endless. Sailors swap stories of journeys down the African coast, trading glass beads for pepper, gold dust for cloves. One weathered man, his beard tangled like rope, insists he once smelt nutmeg before he even saw the island it grew on, the scent carried on the breeze like a siren's song. At night, under a sky thick with stars, the crew hums old sea shanties. One verse you catch is absurd enough to make you grin. Pepper in my pocket, saffron in my stew, marry me, my darling, I'll season life for you. The men roar with laughter at their own song, swigging sour wine and spilling half of it onto the deck. But behind the jokes lies desperation. The Genoese know Venice controls the main artery through Egypt and Constantinople. So they seek side doors, alliances with the Crusader states, gambles in the Black Sea, even risky negotiations with the Mongols. One sailor whispers of a caravan route across the vast steppes that could bring silk and spice to the shores of the Caspian, bypassing Venetian tariffs entirely. Whether truth or tall tale, you lean in, captivated by the possibility. As the voyage continues, storms batter the ship. Salt spray slaps your face, and the wind whips like a living beast. The captain shouts orders, his voice nearly drowned, while you clutch a coil of rope and pray. When the tempest finally calms, the crew finds one barrel split open, its contents lost to the sea. Only a handful of nutmeg bobs among the waves before sinking. A sailor sighs. There goes enough to buy a vineyard. Another mutters, better the sea than the taxman. You return to Genoa's harbor days later, exhausted, but the city greets you with its usual cacophony. A child tugs at your cloak, offering candied ginger for a coin. The sugar crunches between your teeth, fiery and sweet, and you think, this tiny taste traveled halfway across the world, through wars, storms, and smuggling schemes, only to end up in a sticky little hand on a dockside. By evening, you stroll past churches built with spice wealth. Though less grand than Venice's, they stand proud nonetheless. An old friar tells you Genoese traders once donated peppercorns directly as offerings, sprinkling them into alms chests like coins. He chuckles, saints don't cook, but they know value. As you settle into a tavern with rough-hewn beams and smoky air, you realize Genoa is less polished than Venice, but somehow more daring, more alive with risk. This is a city that bets everything on the toss of a wave, a place where spices smell not of luxury, but of hustle. And as you drift into a doze by the fire, the shouts of sailors outside still echo in your ears. Dreams of seas yet to be crossed, and spices still worth dying for. You wake to the thrum of distant hammers and the smell of oak tar. Genoa's echoes fade, and when your eyes open again, you're standing on the sun-bleached coast of Portugal. It's the 15th century now, and here everything feels like the beginning of something larger, something sharper, as though the horizon itself is pulling men westward. The Portuguese don't just trade for spices. They dream of sailing around the world to snatch them at their source. The port of Lisbon bustles with noise. Carts creak under barrels of salted cod. Sailors sling coils of rope across their shoulders, and monks bless outgoing caravels with holy water that splashes as much on the cobblestones as on the ship's hulls. You hear gulls squawking overhead, but beneath that is a more insistent cry. The bark of captains shouting at crews to load supplies for voyages that might last years. Mainstream fact: Portugal, under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, pioneered Atlantic exploration. His school at Sagres trained sailors in navigation, map-making, and ship design, laying groundwork for Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa to India in 1498. That single journey cracked open the spice monopoly held by Venice and Genoa, redirecting wealth and power toward the Iberian Peninsula. But before da Gama, you stand among anxious sailors preparing for shorter expeditions. You overhear one arguing about cargo. We'll need barrels of wine, hardtack beans, and dried figs. Another interrupts. Don't forget citrus, or your teeth will fall out before we reach Madeira. The men laugh, though not lightly. Scurvy is a cruel joke. One Portugal has learned to battle with bitter oranges. You tuck that detail away. Citrus as lifesaver, not garnish. Quirky tidbit. On some early voyages, captains brought along barrels of live chickens not just for eggs, but as feathered compasses. If the birds stopped laying, sailors believed it meant they were sailing into cursed waters. You imagine some poor hen squawking miserably in a storm, while nervous men whisper about omens instead of fixing sails. Historians still argue whether Portugal's expansion was inevitable genius or reckless gamble. Some credit Henry the Navigator's vision, while others say geography forced Portugal's hand. Too small, too poor, with only the sea offering escape. Either way, the gamble works. You step aboard a caravel, slim, triangular sails taut against the wind. It feels fragile compared to Genoa's hulking galleys, yet it dances across the waves with surprising grace. The helmsman gestures proudly. These sails catch the wind from any angle. With them, we can go where galleys fear to tread. Days at sea blur into the rhythm of waves slapping wood, ropes creaking, and the smell of salt crusting everything you own. You watch sailors mark their course not by land, but by stars, tilting their heads back, as if the night sky itself is a spice map. One sailor points at a glittering arc and murmurs, "That one will lead us home, if we live long enough to follow it." When land finally appears, Cape Verde, you stagger onto hot sand, dizzy with relief. Palm trees sway, and the locals eye the newcomers warily. The Portuguese offer trinkets, glass beads, mirrors, even bells, all in hopes of learning what the coast might yield. Rumors swirl of gold inland, but whispers of pepper further south stir more excitement. The men would rather sniff a sack of black seeds than weigh a nugget of gold. Back aboard, the voyage continues down Africa's jagged coast. At each port, scraps of cinnamon or nutmeg surface in trade, like promises of a feast not yet served. But the real dream lies further east, beyond seas no European has yet crossed. One night, huddled under damp sails, you overhear the captain muttering to his logbook. "If we round the Cape, we'll steal Venice's crown. Every sack of pepper will be ours, and Lisbon will shine brighter than any lagoon." You realize this is more than trade. It's revenge against centuries of Venetian dominance. But the ocean exacts its toll. A storm tears through, snapping a mast like a twig. Men curse and pray, some vomiting into the froth. A barrel cracks open, spilling its contents, garlic bulbs rolling across the deck like dice. One sailor shouts above the wind, "Better garlic than pepper. At least garlic won't bankrupt us." The men laugh hysterically, fear mingling with absurd humor, and you cling to a rope, teeth rattling, knowing this fragile vessel is rewriting the fate of continents. When calm finally returns, the men patch sails with scraps of cloth, sing shanties to steady their nerves, and ration dwindling food. You gnaw hardtack so stale it could chip a tooth, softened only by a drizzle of olive oil saved from a cracked jar. The flavor reminds you that even simple seasonings carry power at sea. At last, Lisbon's towers reappear. The harbor bursts into cheers as families rush to meet survivors, clutching whatever small treasures the sailors have brought. A sailor shows off a tiny pouch of cloves, its aroma sharp enough to sting your nose. He crows, "This little pouch is worth more than the ship itself." As you step off the gangplank, you sense Lisbon changing. Taverns buzz with maps of imaginary coasts, bankers whisper about funding expeditions, and priests preach about saving souls overseas. All around you, the spice dream fuels ambition like fire in dry grass. And standing there, you realize, Venice and Genoa's shadow is shrinking, while Portugal's sails are rising like wings against the sky. You blink, and suddenly the Portuguese flags fade, replaced by crimson and gold banners snapping in the wind. Now you're in Seville, Spain, sometime in the late 15th century, when the air crackles with rivalry. If Portugal has cracked open the door to the Indies, Spain is already plotting to knock the whole wall down. You can practically feel the competitive heat radiating off the streets, where merchants shout louder, priests wave incense heavier, and sailors swear bolder oaths than their neighbors across the border. You wander into the harbor. Great hulks of ships rock at their moorings. Larger than the Portuguese caravels, these galleons look like floating fortresses. Men heave cannonballs aboard with grunts, for spice routes are not just about pepper and cinnamon, but also about protecting those riches from everyone else. The docks smell like pitch, fried sardines, and ambition. Mainstream historical fact. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella funded Christopher Columbus, who believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. Instead, he stumbled onto the Americas. Though not the Indies, these new worlds quickly entangled themselves in the spice trade, since Spain hoped to find cinnamon groves and clove forests in the Caribbean. The dream was misguided, but it changed history forever. As you shuffle through Seville's market, you see stall after stall filled with bright fabrics, brassware, figs, and almonds. Yet spices remain scarce, priced as though they're relics of saints. Merchants lean across counters whispering, "A pinch of saffron, a coin of gold." You cough at the absurdity and wonder how many eggs that saffron could actually season. Probably too few for the price. Quirky tidbit. Columbus himself once mistook dried chili peppers in the Caribbean for Asian black pepper. In his journals, he proudly declared he had found the coveted spice, even though the flavor scorched tongues in an entirely different way. Imagine those first Spaniards nibbling a chili, coughing violently, then insisting through watery eyes, "Yes, yes, just like Venice's peppercorns." Historians still argue whether Columbus genuinely believed he had found Asia, or whether he clung to the delusion for the sake of his patron's pride. Some think he knew the land was different, but feared losing royal funding if he admitted failure. Either way, his voyages cracked Europe wide open to a whole hemisphere of plants, cacao, tobacco, potatoes, tomatoes, and yes, chilies, that would reshape diets as profoundly as any sack of cloves. But spices remain the heartbeat. You hear sailors in a tavern plotting their next voyage. Gold is good, silver better, but bring me nutmeg, and I'll buy a castle. They slam their mugs of wine together, foam splashing onto the sawdust floor. Across the room, a priest frowns at their oaths, but even he stirs his stew with saffron, paid for by indulgence coins collected from peasants. Seville hums with anticipation. Every street feels like a funnel leading to the river, where ships slip away toward horizons that might or might not exist. You pause to watch one depart, sails swelling like lungs. Families wave kerchiefs, women cry into shawls, and street dogs bark at the fading hull. Someone murmurs beside you, "Each voyage is a gamble. Half will never return." You realize spices aren't just expensive, they're soaked in risk. The Spanish crown establishes the Casa de Contratación, a massive bureaucratic nerve center in Seville, where maps are locked away like treasure and all trade is recorded with obsessive precision. Clerks in ink-stained robes argue over ledgers. 2 sacks of pepper equal 5 slaves, no 6. You feel queasy, realizing the spice trade is already shackled to human misery. The sweetness of cinnamon carries the bitterness of exploitation. You slip into a kitchen where cooks bustle over copper pots. A noble's feast is underway. Roasted quail dusted with nutmeg, rice tinted golden with saffron, and almond pastries perfumed with cinnamon. The cooks shoo you aside, but not before you sneak a taste of the rice. The saffron bursts with flavor, floral and metallic, leaving your tongue tingling. You think, so this is why kings mortgage kingdoms. Outside, a ragged beggar coughs, clutching a crust of bread without even a sprinkle of spice. The contrast is sharp. Spices divide the world into those who can afford flavor and those who must chew blandness forever. One evening, you find yourself aboard a Spanish galleon leaving port. The decks groan under barrels of dried meat, salted fish, and hardtack. A few sacks of pepper and saffron are locked in the captain's cabin, guarded more closely than the gunpowder. Sailors play dice with sheep knuckles, the clatter mixing with the crash of waves. One jokes, "If the king loves saffron so much, maybe we should sprinkle some on the sails. They'll carry us faster." Everyone laughs, weary but eager. Weeks pass, the horizon unchanging. The sea smells like damp rope and unwashed men. A sailor gnaws a biscuit and mutters, "I'd give my soul for a clove." Another answers, "The devil can't afford cloves." They laugh, though thinly, hunger pressing into their ribs. You chew with them, your jaw aching from stale bread, and wonder if spices aren't just luxuries but medicine for sanity at sea. Finally land. Palms rise against the sky, parrots squawk in bursts of scarlet and green, and strange fruits dangle like ornaments. The crew scrambles ashore, hoping to sniff pepper, to pluck cinnamon bark. Instead, they find chili plants and cacao pods. The captain writes in his log with trembling hands, "Not the Indies, but treasures still." You touch a cocoa bean, bitter and unassuming, unaware it will one day fuel global chocolate obsession. As the galleon turns back towards Spain, its hold filled with gold, silver, and strange plants instead of cloves, you understand something crucial. Spain may not have seized Asia's spices yet, but it has stumbled into a different empire, one that will reshape tastes, fortunes, and even waistlines across Europe. And back in Seville, as you step once more onto cobblestones and hear merchants gossip about yet another voyage, you know the race for spices has only grown fiercer. If Portugal is clever, Spain is stubborn, and together they are rewriting the map of the world with saffron stains and peppercorn dreams. The cobblestones of Seville dissolve under your feet, and suddenly you're standing in the lush, humid air of the Spice Islands themselves. Today we call them the Maluku Islands, tucked deep in what is now eastern Indonesia. But to Europeans of the 16th century, this place was nothing short of paradise, and a paradise worth killing over. The first thing that hits you is the scent. Imagine a forest, but instead of pine needles or damp soil, the air drips with nutmeg and clove blossoms. The fragrance is so heady it feels like you could bottle it and sell it for ransom. The trees themselves don't look especially regal, ordinary green, rough-bark trunks, but each tiny bud and seed is worth more than gold back in Europe. You pick up a clove bud from the ground, dark and shriveled, and hold it in your hand. In Seville, this little thing could buy a chicken. A handful might pay for a wedding feast. A barrel could change a dynasty. Mainstream historical fact. The Spice Islands were the world's only source of nutmeg, mace, and cloves for centuries. These rare plants grew nowhere else, which meant whoever controlled the islands controlled the global supply. That monopoly was both a blessing and a curse for the local rulers. Quirky tidbit. Villagers here sometimes chewed cloves as a kind of ancient breath mint, to freshen mouths before important meetings or religious ceremonies. Imagine if your toothpaste cost a fortune and you casually chomped it like candy. Historians still argue whether the indigenous sultans of Ternate and Tidor truly grasped just how insane the European hunger for spices was. Some think the islanders cleverly manipulated Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch traders against each other, playing alliances like a chessboard. Others argue that once muskets and cannons arrived, the local balance of power shattered too quickly for any real long-term control. You find yourself walking into a bustling harbor at Ternate. Outrigger canoes bob beside towering European ships, their decks bristling with cannons. Local merchants wear sarongs and turbans, their chests glistening in the equatorial sun. They carry baskets of nutmeg wrapped in palm leaves, while Portuguese traders in heavy wool doublets wipe sweat from their brows, trying not to faint in the heat. One mutters, "A fortune in a basket," as he peers at the fruit like it's the Holy Grail. At the royal court, things look different again. The Sultan of Ternate sits beneath a canopy, his attendants fanning him with palm fronds. A Portuguese envoy bows deeply, offering barrels of gunpowder, iron tools, and a jeweled crucifix. The Sultan, unimpressed, plucks a clove bud and rolls it between his fingers. He knows exactly how much power this tiny thing gives him. Yet outside the palace walls, ordinary villagers live more simply. You sit cross-legged with a family as they stir a fragrant stew over a clay pot, tossing in nutmeg and cloves as casually as you'd sprinkle salt. To them, the spices are just food, part of life, not the crown jewels of empires. You slurp the broth, it's sweet, warm, and exotic, and think of sailors back in Europe paying a month's wages just to flavor their mutton. The unfairness is almost laughable. At night, the harbor hums with suspicion. Portuguese guards patrol with lanterns, watching both local rivals and Spanish spies. For Spain hasn't given up. After all, Magellan's fleet circled the globe to try to reach these islands. Only one ship made it home, but that battered vessel carried just enough cloves in its hold to cover the expedition's enormous costs and still turn a profit. Imagine that, thousands dead, ships lost, years of hardship, all redeemed by sacks of dried flower buds. The locals have their own quiet resistance. You overhear a farmer whispering to another, "Hide some nutmeg. Don't sell it all. Let them fight over scraps." The idea is brilliant. By keeping some supply out of European hands, they ensure future bargaining power. But greed is a relentless tide, and muskets are louder than whispers. Soon enough, you hear the echoes of skirmishes. Muskets crack, swords clash, and smoke from burning villages stings your eyes. The Europeans don't just want trade, they want control. Fortresses rise on hilltops, stone walls glaring down at coconut palms. Cannons point out to sea, daring rivals to approach. Every spice-laden ship that sails out of the harbor carries with it the weight of blood. One evening, you watch a Portuguese captain haggling with local rulers. He gestures at crates of silver coins, but the sultans shake their heads. One finally says, "Guns. We want guns." The Europeans smirk, knowing each musket they hand over only makes tomorrow's conquest more tangled. And still the clove trees bloom. White star-shaped flowers fall gently to the forest floor, as though unaware of the battles raging in their shade. You walk beneath them, the perfume heavy in your lungs, and wonder whether nature laughs at human greed. By dawn, ships depart again. Portuguese sails fade, Spanish caravels sneak into nearby bays, and local canoes dart between them like fish among sharks. Every faction believes itself cleverer than the others, but you can't shake the sense that the true masters here are not kings or captains. They are the trees themselves. They dictate the hunger. They draw men across oceans. They make and unmake empires, one fragrant bud at a time. The trade winds shift, and you find yourself rocked gently on the deck of a ship bound westward, away from the Spice Islands. Ahead lies Goa, the Portuguese jewel on the coast of India, glowing under the tropical sun. By the mid-16th century, this bustling port has become the nerve center of Portugal's Eastern Empire, the place where nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and cloves all funnel before heading back toward Lisbon. The moment you step onto the wharf, it feels like the entire world has squeezed into one chaotic bazaar. You hear Portuguese sailors cursing as they heave barrels onto carts, Gujarati merchants haggling in rapid-fire Hindi, Chinese traders showing off delicate porcelain, and local goans shouting over piles of ginger and pepper. The air is so thick with cardamom and cinnamon dust that your nose tingles. If you sneeze here, it probably smells like dessert. Mainstream historical fact: Goa became the capital of Portuguese India in 1510, seized from the Sultan of Bijapur. From that point on, it served as the hub through which nearly all Portuguese spice profits flowed, feeding Lisbon's treasury and funding its overseas ambitions. Quirky tidbit: Jesuit missionaries in Goa sometimes used cinnamon and clove oils as makeshift remedies for toothaches among converts. Picture a priest holding someone's jaw open, dripping clove oil in while muttering a blessing. Medieval dentistry with a dash of spice, literally. Historians still argue whether Portugal truly had a monopoly at this stage, or whether smuggling by Arab, Gujarati, and Malay merchants continued under the radar, undermining Lisbon's claim of total control. Some records suggest massive leakage in the system, enough that Portuguese kings complained about disappearing profits. You wander through the narrow streets. Colonial mansions with whitewashed walls stand beside Hindu temples, mosques, and Catholic churches. In the markets, women in bright saris sell turmeric-stained rice, while friars in long robes shuffle by, clutching rosaries. This strange mingling of cultures feels like an entire continent compressed into a few square miles. At the customs house, Portuguese clerks furiously scratch away with quills. One tallies sacks of pepper, another seals crates of nutmeg with the royal emblem. A third counts silver ingots coming in from Europe to pay local suppliers. The mathematics of empire is exhausting. Ton after ton of spice weighed, taxed, and repackaged. You stop at a spice warehouse, where men climb ladders to stack giant sacks higher than their heads. Inside, the smell almost overwhelms you. Pepper sharp, nutmeg sweet, cinnamon warm. One sailor mutters, "This smell will haunt me till I die." You believe him. His clothes, his skin, even his hair must carry that scent back across the oceans. But Goa isn't only about trade. At night, the taverns fill with sailors who gamble away wages, drink fiery palm wine, and tell tall tales of storms, sea monsters, and pirate attacks. A Portuguese officer leans toward you, whispering, "I once saw an Arab dhow stuffed with cloves sink in sight of shore." The sea itself smelled like a kitchen for weeks. He slams down his mug as though daring the world to doubt him. Beyond the drunken boasting, you notice something more sinister: the constant tension between Portuguese colonists and locals. Catholic officials pressure Hindus to convert, while Muslim merchants bristle under Christian oversight. Goa is vibrant, yes, but it's also a powder keg of competing faiths and ambitions. Still, for Lisbon, it is paradise, or at least a vault overflowing with treasure. Ships leave Goa each year in tightly guarded fleets called the carracks. These lumbering giants groan under the weight of spices, silk, and porcelain, their holds stacked so tightly that rats sometimes suffocate before sailors do. Each voyage back to Portugal is perilous. Storms, pirates, and scurvy lurk at every wave, but the profits are astronomical. As you watch one such carrack being loaded, a A sailor jokes. This one ship holds enough cinnamon to buy half of Lisbon. His friend slaps him on the back. Aye, if it makes it past the French corsairs. They laugh nervously, but you can see in their eyes that the danger is real. You walk through a quieter part of the city, where convent bells toll. Here, nuns prepare spiced sweets, blending cinnamon into rice puddings and nutmeg into bread for feast days. It's almost comical. What could bankrupt kings in Europe is here folded casually into dessert by women in plain habits. But not everyone in Goa shares in the wealth. Outside the walls, laborers haul sacks barefoot, their backs bent under impossible loads. Fishermen mend nets in the mud, selling their catch for pennies while watching Portuguese elites strut past in embroidered doublets. Empires always look different depending on where you stand. Night falls, and lanterns glow along the waterfront. You sit on a crate, the smell of cardamom lingering in the humid air. Ships creak, anchors clink, and the sea breathes slowly against the shore. For all its noise and chaos, Goa feels like a beating heart, pumping spice-laden lifeblood through the arteries of an empire that believes itself eternal. And yet, even now, you sense that Portugal's grip won't last forever. Rivals sharpen their knives. Dutch and English ships are already prowling the Indian Ocean, eyeing Goa's riches. For the moment, Portugal rules the game, but the spices themselves seem indifferent, waiting patiently to see who will next fall under their spell. The humid night of Goa drifts away, and suddenly you find yourself somewhere colder, darker, and more northern. It's the port of Amsterdam in the early 17th century, and the air is sharp with salt, tar, and ambition. The Dutch Republic has entered the spice race, and unlike the Portuguese, these merchants are not content with simply taking a share. They want it all. The dockside bristles with activity. Tall ships with orange, white, and blue flags rise like floating fortresses. Their hulls are freshly tarred, their sails crisp, their crews eager. On the quay, merchants in black cloaks and wide hats haggle with ship captains. Ledgers are opened, accounts balanced, and profits dreamed. Every guild in the city seems invested, from wealthy widows to humble cobblers, each holding a share in this new beast, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. Mainstream historical fact. Founded in 1602, the VOC was the world's first joint stock company, allowing thousands of ordinary Dutch citizens to invest in overseas spice trade ventures. Its innovative structure made it not just a trading firm, but also a proto-state, able to sign treaties, wage war, and establish colonies. Quirky tidbit. Some investors got so addicted to VOC speculation that Amsterdam's early stock exchange became almost like a gambling den. One man supposedly bought shares with money borrowed from his barber, convinced that nutmeg alone would make him rich. You imagine him explaining this with a mouth full of shaving cream. Historians still argue whether the VOC's incredible profits came more from genuine trade or from ruthless monopolies enforced with violence. Was it economic brilliance or organized plunder? The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere sticky in between. You drift through Amsterdam's narrow streets, canals glittering with lantern light. Behind curtained windows, merchants sip warm spiced wine, their wealth perfumed by cinnamon and cloves. In smoky taverns, sailors brag about faraway lands, Banda, Batavia, Maluku. Their words mingle with the clatter of mugs and the squeak of fiddles. Amsterdam hums like a hive, and the honey is nutmeg. At the heart of it all stands the VOC headquarters, a stone fortress of bureaucracy. Inside, maps stretch across walls, red lines tracing the routes from Europe to Asia. Piles of paperwork tower higher than some men, detailing cargoes, contracts, and the miserable deaths of sailors. The clerks here wield pens like weapons, deciding who gets rich and who goes bankrupt. You lean over a ledger. Ship new horn, 200 barrels nutmeg, 100 barrels cloves, 30 barrels mace. The numbers gleam like gold. You realize each barrel might mean an entire island's harvest. In the harbor, you watch a fleet prepare to sail east. Cannons are polished, ropes coiled, dried cheese and salted fish crammed into the holds. Sailors wave to loved ones, though many know they'll never return. Some joke nervously about the 3-month voyage to the Cape of Good Hope, where disease and storms lurk. If the sea doesn't take us, the Banda Islanders will, one mutters. His friend elbows him. Better the islanders than the Dutch governor. They laugh, but it's the kind of laugh that hides dread. As you follow the bustle, the smell of nutmeg oil clings to everything. So much so that even the rats in Amsterdam's warehouses must have smelled like pie filling. Ships creak, bells toll, and somewhere a child chases pigeons across the cobbles, her snack wrapped in paper dusted with cinnamon. The empire of spice seeps even into nursery snacks. The power of the VOC isn't only in its ships, but in its ruthlessness. The company decides that controlling the source is better than just buying the product. So it wages war in the East Indies, fortifies ports, and installs governors who answer only to Amsterdam. This is not gentle trade, it's empire with an accounting department. You picture a shareholder meeting, men nodding gravely as they vote to blockade an island or burn excess spice to keep prices high. Imagine someone suggesting, "Let's destroy half the nutmeg crop this year. It'll double our profits." Heads nod, quills scratch, and a distant island smolders without a single shareholder shedding a tear. Back in Amsterdam, though, the city glows with prosperity. Canals are lined with stately homes, their windows filled with tulips, their kitchens fragrant with imported spices. Children grow up thinking nutmeg in porridge is normal, not realizing it costs lives oceans away. You stroll along a canal as church bells toll midnight. Reflections shimmer in the water, broken by the occasional ripple of a passing barge. The whole city seems drunk on its newfound wealth, convinced that with the VOC's power, nothing can go wrong. And yet you sense the undercurrent, envy from rivals, anger from colonized peoples, and the sheer human cost behind every barrel. For now, Amsterdam dazzles, a jewel built on spice, but you can almost hear the creak of the ships that will one day bring its golden age to an end. The lanterns flicker, the canals sigh, and you lean against a railing, realizing you've just walked through the beating heart of capitalism's first great experiment. A stock market empire built on cinnamon, nutmeg, and a willingness to squeeze islands dry. The night air of Amsterdam fades, and when you blink again, you're no longer by the canals but sailing east with the Dutch fleet. The waves roll beneath you, and the ship rocks like a cradle that is somehow both comforting and threatening. The sails stretch overhead, swollen with the wind, and the horizon blurs in salty mist. Ahead lies the true prize, the Banda Islands, where nutmeg grows and men are willing to kill or die for it. The Banda Archipelago seems almost dreamlike when you first catch sight of it. Green hills rise steeply from turquoise waters, ringed with coral reefs. Coconut palms sway above white sand beaches, and inland the scent of nutmeg drifts across the forest. Each tree seems ordinary at first glance, but when its fruit splits open, revealing a glossy brown nut wrapped in crimson mace, it's like a jewel from nature's own treasure chest. Mainstream historical fact. The Banda Islands were the world's only source of nutmeg and mace until the 19th century. This monopoly made them unimaginably valuable, a handful of specks on the map dictating fortunes of nations. Quirky tidbit. Bandanese traders once used nutmeg as a form of mosquito repellent, rubbing the fragrant oil onto their skin to keep the pests away. You can imagine a Dutch sailor watching this with envy, scratching furiously at his ankles while swearing in 3 languages. Historians still argue whether the Dutch conquest of Banda was an inevitable clash of economics or an avoidable tragedy born of greed. Could peaceful trade have worked, or did the hunger for monopoly make violence unavoidable? The debate lingers like the scent of spice itself. As you wander through a Bandanese village in your dreamlike drift, you hear the laughter of children, the scrape of canoes pulled onto shore, and the clink of nutmeg being dried in the sun. The villagers trade freely with English, Portuguese, and Chinese merchants alike, welcoming competition. To them, nutmeg is wealth, but not something to hoard with paranoia. They believe in abundance, not monopoly. The Dutch, however, see it differently. Their ships bring not just goods but soldiers, cannons, and contracts written in languages the islanders do not speak. They demand exclusivity, and when it is denied, the VOC turns to force. You step into a smoky Dutch encampment, where officers sit at a rough-hewn table, drinking spiced wine over maps of Bonda. "We must have the trade to ourselves," one insists, stabbing the map with his knife. "If they sell to the English, our profits vanish." Another nods grimly. The decision is made, conquest disguised as commerce. The following months are chaos. Dutch troops storm villages, cannons boom across bays, and nutmeg groves burn. Survivors scatter into the hills, while others are enslaved to work the very plantations that once belonged to their families. The paradise of Bonda becomes a prison of profit. You watch in horrified stillness as soldiers pile up sacks of nutmeg like loot, their boots crunching across scorched earth. And yet, amid the brutality, absurdity creeps in. One Dutch commander reportedly insisted his cooks add nutmeg to nearly every dish, convinced it warded off the plague. Imagine biting into nutmeg-flavored salted fish 3 meals a day. You'd almost welcome scurvy just for variety. From the deck of a Dutch ship, you look back at the islands. The forests seem peaceful again from a distance, their hills washed in green. But you know what happened beneath those leaves: the forced labor, the massacres, the heavy silence of loss. The VOC has turned a community's wealth into a corporate monopoly. Still, even empires of spice leave unintended traces. Bandanese words slip into Dutch sailor slang. Recipes mingle across cultures. And nutmeg itself, that warm, aromatic powder, eventually drifts into kitchens across the world, into pies, puddings, and eggnog. A strange afterlife for something so fiercely contested. The wind stiffens. Sailors haul ropes and sing a hoarse chant, their voices carried out into the endless ocean. You lean against the railing, feeling the tension between wonder and horror. Nutmeg smells sweet, but history here reeks of smoke. The Bonda Islands shrink behind you, swallowed by mist. Ahead lies Batavia, the VOC's stronghold, where the company will orchestrate more conquests, more monopolies, more profits. But for now, you close your eyes against the spray, letting the ship rock you into uneasy calm. The waves slap the hull, the rigging creaks, and in your half-sleep, you wonder if every pinch of nutmeg in a cookie still carries a whisper of Banda's forests, its lost voices mingling forever with the spice. The salt air lingers in your lungs as the Dutch fleet presses onward, sails taut against the monsoon winds. Soon the ship glides into the busy port of Batavia, modern Jakarta, where the Dutch East India Company has built its headquarters, a fortress of trade and ambition. The city brims with the sound of hammers on wood, the chatter of merchants in a dozen tongues, and the aroma of spices wafting from every direction. Yet under the bustling veneer lies something harsher. Batavia is less a city and more a corporate capital, where profit outweighs mercy. Mainstream historical fact: Batavia, founded in 1619 by the VOC, became the administrative hub of the Dutch Spice Empire, coordinating plantations, trade routes, and military campaigns across Southeast Asia. From here, governors and merchants plotted how to maintain their grip on nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon. You wander through narrow streets where canals run like veins through the city. Dutch houses with high gables stand beside bamboo huts, a jarring patchwork of worlds. The heat is heavy, and you notice Europeans sweltering in wool coats, stubbornly clinging to fashion meant for Amsterdam winters. Locals stroll past with amused glances, probably thinking, "These people are going to melt like butter in a spice pan." Quirky tidbit: the Dutch in Batavia were so obsessed with replicating home comforts that they built their own cheese-making operations right there in the tropics. Imagine sweating through a 40-degree day while stirring curds, just so you could have Gouda with your nutmeg tea. But Batavia is not just an outpost, it is a machine. Ships sail out heavy with spices, returning with silver, textiles, and more weapons to enforce control. Warehouses tower above the harbor, their thick wooden doors guarding fortunes that could topple monarchs. Inside, the smell is overwhelming. Mountains of cloves stacked like firewood, nutmeg packed in crates, cinnamon bark tied into bundles. The mingled scent is intoxicating, but also suffocating, as if greed itself has a smell. Historians still argue whether Batavia's rise was a remarkable feat of global coordination or an exploitative system that drained wealth from Asia into European vaults. Was it the dawn of global capitalism, or simply another empire with sharper accounting? The debate ripples on, like water across the harbor. You stroll past the market, where merchants haggle with the precision of duelists. A handful of cloves changes hands, then vanishes into a pouch bound for Persia. A bag of peppercorns goes one way, nutmeg the other. Each tiny parcel seems insignificant, yet collectively they are worth more than fleets of silver. The spices gleam in the tropical sun like jewels, except these jewels can be grated into soup. In the governor's hall, the mood is colder. Men in stiff collars lean over maps marked with red pins. The English threaten our monopoly, one says. We must expand further east. Their fingers trace islands you can barely see on a map, each one a potential gold mine or graveyard. Their voices are flat, detached, as if deciding which villages will burn is just another line item in a ledger. And yet, even here, human life resists reduction. You notice Javanese women in bright sarongs selling bundles of herbs and spices outside the fortress, laughing and gossiping as if no empire could silence them. A boy darts between soldiers carrying a tray of sweet cakes flavored with cinnamon, giggling when one guard pretends to chase him. The small sounds of everyday joy thread through the city, reminding you that life is never only commerce and conquest. From the ramparts of Batavia, the horizon stretches wide. Ships come and go, carrying not just goods but stories, languages, and recipes. A sailor returns from Bonda with nutmeg and tales of storms. Another sets sail for Ceylon to secure cinnamon. A clerk scribbles figures into a ledger, unaware that he is helping build the bones of modern capitalism. Quirky voices float through the air, too. One Dutchman brags in a tavern that nutmeg can cure flatulence, while another insists cloves keep moths from eating your clothes. You glance around and think, if anyone had actually tested these claims, maybe they'd have spared themselves a few wars. But then again, why let science ruin a perfectly good excuse for conquest? As night falls, the city changes. The canals reflect lantern light, glowing like ribbons of fire. You hear the murmur of prayers from a mosque, the clink of glasses in Dutch parlors, the thud of dice in gambling dens. Batavia never really sleeps, because profit never does. The spice trade is both lullaby and alarm bell, rocking you into uneasy dreams. You walk along the harbor once more, watching a ship being loaded with crates of nutmeg bound for Europe. Each crate is stamped with the VOC seal, a reminder that even nature's gifts have been branded, owned, and weaponized. Sailors haul ropes, sweating under the stars, while an officer checks the cargo list with cold precision. Somewhere inside those crates lies the future of fortunes, wars, and desserts. The smell of spices saturates the air so thoroughly that you almost can't separate one from another. Nutmeg's warmth blurs into the sharpness of cloves, into the sweetness of cinnamon. It's dizzying, as though history itself has steeped into the air, and you can't breathe without inhaling empire. Batavia recedes behind you as your dream drifts on. But the city clings, its scent lodged in your throat, a mixture of salt, sweat, and spice. The capital of monopoly, the heart of greed, the place where global trade first hardened into something colder and sharper. You can almost hear the whispered creak of ledgers closing, like a lullaby in the language of commerce. The wind shifts, and with it your dream drifts from Batavia's crowded docks toward a far horizon, northwest, across the Arabian Sea, past the Red Sea Gateway, and into the heart of Europe. Suddenly you find yourself in Amsterdam, the richest city of the 17th century, a place where spices from half a world away transformed into power, palaces, and pastries. You walk the narrow cobbled streets, flanked by tall brick houses with gabled roofs that lean slightly, as if listening to gossip. The canals glisten like mirrors under a pale Dutch sky, boats bumping gently against the sides as they unload their cargo. And the air, despite being thousands of miles from tropical islands, still carries that faint whisper of spice, as though cloves and nutmeg have found a way to perfume even northern fog. Mainstream historical fact: Amsterdam became the financial hub of the Dutch Golden Age, home not only to VOC headquarters, but also the world's first official stock exchange. Investors could buy shares in spice voyages, spreading both risk and reward, turning maritime adventure into a marketplace that anyone with enough guilders could join. You wander past the Beurs, the exchange itself, and notice a crowd buzzing with excitement. Men in wide collars and felt hats shout numbers, hands darting like birds. A few steps away, in a tavern, smaller investors drink beer flavored with a sprinkle of cinnamon, pretending they own a slice of the world. The entire city hums with the thrill of speculation, as if every canal and alleyway is one more line on a balance sheet. And yet, even amid the banking clamor, life has flavor, literally. You smell freshly baked Dutch speculoos cookies, heavy with cloves and nutmeg, sold from stalls near the market. Housewives argue over the price of cinnamon sticks, while apothecaries grind nutmeg into powders they claim can cure plague, gout, or heartbreak. Spoiler, only one of those is true, and it's not the plague. Quirky tidbit: Amsterdam was so spice-obsessed that nutmeg became part of funeral rituals. In some wealthy households, mourners were offered spiced wine flavored with nutmeg and cinnamon as they paid their respects. Imagine leaving this world accompanied by what amounts to a mulled wine toast. Not the worst way to go. Inside grand houses along the canal, you glimpse merchants feasting. A roast goose glistens on the table, sprinkled with cloves, surrounded by side dishes that sparkle with nutmeg and cinnamon. The air is thick with indulgence, as though Europe has rediscovered flavor after centuries of bland porridge. You probably wouldn't survive the calorie count, let alone the cholesterol, but at least your tongue would die happy. Historians still argue whether Amsterdam's golden age was truly golden, or if it was gilded with wealth extracted at terrible cost. Was the stock exchange the birth of modern financial democracy, or just a polished front for exploitation? The debate lingers like spiced dust in the air, sweet but irritating if you breathe too much in. As you drift further into the city, you notice painters setting up canvases. Rembrandt peers from a studio window, his hands smudged with ochre. Vermeer mixes paints in quiet concentration, perhaps capturing a still life of a spice jar glowing on a Delft table. These artists, too, are part of the spice story, because without merchant fortunes, who would have paid for portraits or bought the art? At the docks, ships arrive heavy with more than cargo. They carry rumors. Sailors stumble off with tales of storm-tossed seas and jungles where trees bleed sap like tears. Some mutter about massacres in Bonda, while others exaggerate stories of nutmeg curing seasickness or cloves chasing away rats. The truth blurs, carried across oceans like a whisper. You catch fragments and realize, for most Europeans, spices are both miracle and myth, seasoning and superstition. The paradox sharpens in Amsterdam's spice auctions. You stand in a crowded hall, the air buzzing with anticipation. Crates are opened, and suddenly the scent of cloves bursts forth like a genie from a lamp. Buyers lean forward, eyes shining, as if hypnotized by that aroma. Numbers fly: 200 guilders, 300 for. By the end of the day, fortunes change hands over what could fit into a kitchen drawer. You realize something strange. Even here, where spices are plentiful, they remain luxury. The prices are absurd, the auctions tense. Ordinary people might sniff cinnamon at a market stall but rarely own much. A jar of nutmeg in a wealthy pantry is a statement piece, like owning a sports car today. Spices are edible wealth, flaunted as much as savored. In quieter corners of Amsterdam, though, the mood softens. A young mother sprinkles cinnamon on porridge for her children. A baker shapes spiced bread that will comfort dock workers after a long shift. The same cinnamon that crowns a goose in a merchant's hall also warms the bellies of apprentices. Spice trickles down in flavor, even if wealth does not. By evening, the city glows with lanterns reflecting on the canals. The water shimmers, carrying faint echoes of laughter, commerce, and the creak of ships readying for sea again. Somewhere, A merchant counts profits by candlelight, while a poet scribbles about cinnamon's sweetness. Life here is threaded through with spice, as if every heartbeat in Amsterdam has a hint of nutmeg's warmth. And as you drift along, you realize that Amsterdam is not just a city of canals and markets. It's the place where the spice dream hardened into modern economics. Here, risk became investment, taste became commodity, and food became finance. Spices once traded like treasure now moved like numbers, digits on ledgers, shares in voyages. It is beautiful, dazzling, and a little chilling, like the glow of lanterns on water, bright yet fragile. You pause at a canal bridge, the scent of cloves still clinging in your nose, and watch as the city exhales into the night. From Batavia's harsh monopoly to Amsterdam's glittering auctions, the spice empire stretches like a thread across oceans, binding distant islands to this chilly northern port. And you, still drifting in the dream, are caught in that thread too, woven into the long, fragrant tapestry of desire and power. Your dream drifts one last time, away from Amsterdam's canals and back across oceans, until you find yourself standing in a quieter space, somewhere between past and present. The story of spices has carried you thousands of miles and hundreds of years, from Egyptian embalming tables dusted with cinnamon to Dutch warehouses stacked with nutmeg. And now, as the lanterns dim and the voices fade, you realize you've been following a single shimmering thread. The way tiny things, seeds, bark, buds, reshaped empires and rewrote daily life. You breathe in deeply, as though the air itself is infused with cloves and cinnamon, and begin to notice how much of their legacy lingers in your own kitchen today. A pinch of nutmeg in mashed potatoes, cinnamon sprinkled over coffee, or pepper ground onto a late-night snack. Each is a ghost of those caravans, galleons, and palaces. You taste the echoes of fortunes, wars, and voyages every time you season dinner. Mainstream historical fact: the global spice trade eventually lost its golden sheen. By the 18th century, spices became more widely available, prices dropped, and the monopoly grip of the Dutch and Portuguese began to crumble. Once worth more than gold, nutmeg became something you could buy at a corner shop. What once toppled kings now simply tops oatmeal. Quirky tidbit: Napoleon's army reportedly carried sacks of cinnamon and pepper not just as rations, but also to mask the smell of marching men. Imagine a battlefield reeking of sweat, gunpowder, and cinnamon buns. Not quite the bakery you'd want to visit, but still, spice clinging stubbornly to human history in the oddest corners. Historians still argue whether the spice trade was more about flavor or medicine. Was it desire for deliciousness that drove Europe mad, or a belief that nutmeg and cloves could banish plague and prolong life? Maybe it was both, tangled together, one more reminder of how humans rarely want just one thing. As you look back through the haze of your dream, faces emerge: Roman cooks pounding pepper in mortars, Venetian merchants counting coins, Arab sailors guiding dhows by the stars, Dutch traders scribbling contracts. Even ordinary people, like the medieval pilgrim carrying cinnamon as a token or the housewife sprinkling cloves into mulled wine, shaped this saga in their own small ways. History is never only about kings and empires. It's about you too, seasoning your own plate in the dark of night. And so the story comes full circle. The many spices that once cost more than gold now sit quietly in jars, forgotten until you reach for them. They are no longer treasure, but they remain magic. Proof that desire can carry people across oceans, that taste can topple cities, that flavor can build fortunes. The journey of spices is the journey of longing itself. And as your dream begins to soften, you carry that lesson gently. The smallest things can change the largest worlds. Now the story settles, and so do you. The drums and clamor of distant markets fade into a low hum, the auctions and sea voyages falling quiet as though someone has slowly closed a door. What remains is the soft scent of cinnamon lingering in your imagination, like the faint warmth left by a candle after it's blown out. Your breath slows. Your body grows heavy. The sharp edges of history blur into something tender, something that no longer asks you to remember details, but only to rest in the feeling of it all. The glow of firelight on spice jars, the rustle of sails, the hush of a European city at dusk. Each inhale feels spiced with comfort, each exhale releasing the last fragments of tension. You imagine yourself floating on a calm sea now, no storms, no cannon fire, no frantic merchants counting coins, just gentle waves carrying you towards stillness. Above, the stars spread like a quiet map, guiding you home to sleep. And as your eyelids grow heavier, the spices you've carried through this journey transform into dreams. Cinnamon softens into warmth, nutmeg becomes calm, pepper fades into silence. The world that once chased these treasures with feverish hunger now releases them freely into your night as gifts of peace. Let your mind drift. Let the story dissolve into silence. You are safe, you are still, you are sinking into rest. Spices once cost more than gold, but tonight they cost nothing. Only a sigh, a breath, a dream. Good night.